shouldn't be telling anyone this. Part of me thinks I should just close this document and forget the whole thing. But I can't. I haven't been able to forget it for 3 years, and I don't think I ever will. My brother disappeared in February 2023. The police did their investigation, filed their reports, and eventually the case went cold. Mum still puts appeals on Facebook every few months, sharing that same photo of him from Christmas 2022. Dad doesn't talk about it at all anymore. And me? I'm the only one who knows what actually happened, and I've never told them. I don't think I can. His name is Daniel. Was Daniel. I keep doing that, switching between past and present like some part of me still can't accept it. He was Danny to most people. He was 26 when he vanished, 4 years older than me, and we'd always been close despite the age gap. He worked in admin, nothing glamorous, and he lived alone in a flat in Reading. Ordinary life, ordinary job, ordinary bloke. That's what made it all so much worse, I think. How someone so normal could end up involved in something so horrific. The police released his flat back to us about 6 months after he disappeared. They'd been through everything, found nothing useful, and eventually they had to let us clear the place out. The landlord wanted it back. I volunteered to help Mum and Dad sort through his things, because I knew it would destroy them to do it alone. What I didn't expect was to find his laptop tucked under his bed, password protected, completely missed by the police somehow. I know I shouldn't have, but I took it, slipped it into my bag whilst Mum was crying over his clothes in the wardrobe. Told myself I just wanted to see if there were any photos on there, maybe some memories we could have. But really, I think I was looking for answers, some explanation for why he just vanished one day without a word to anyone. Getting past his password wasn't difficult. He'd always used the same few combinations for everything, and I knew them all from years of him asking me to check his emails or his bank account when he couldn't be bothered. The laptop was old, probably 5 or 6 years at that point, and it took ages to start up. When it finally did, I went straight to his browser history. That's where it started to get strange. Most of it was normal enough. News sites, YouTube, his work portal, some shopping sites. But then I noticed gaps. Whole evenings where there was nothing. No activity at all, which seemed odd for someone who spent most of his free time online. I'm not technical, but it struck me as odd all the same. Danny lived online. Even on quiet nights there was always something. A video, a forum, a stupid rabbit hole. Here there was just nothing. Long stretches of nothing. It felt intentional, even if I couldn't explain why. I found a folder buried in his documents called Work Archive 2022. Seemed innocent enough, except Danny was meticulous about keeping work stuff on his work laptop, never his personal one. Inside were just 3 files. One was a text document with what looked like random letters and numbers. No structure to it, no obvious meaning. The second was a bookmark file, but when I tried to open it, nothing happened. And the third was a small application I didn't recognize. I nearly deleted them. Nearly just closed the laptop and forgot about it. But something made me double-click that application. What opened wasn't anything I recognized. It looked like a browser, but stripped back, basic. There was a search bar and nothing else. No favorites, no history visible, no helpful buttons. Just this blank waiting screen. I sat there staring at it for a while, trying to work out what it was for, and then I noticed the URL bar. It didn't say anything normal. It was just a string of random characters ending in .onion. That's when it clicked, slowly and unpleasantly. I didn't recognize the address format, but I recognized the feeling of it, the wrongness. I'd heard about places like this before, in passing, In documentaries I half watched while scrolling on my phone. I just never thought I'd be staring at one on my brother's laptop, but I'd always thought it was just some exaggerated thing from crime documentaries, not something real people actually used. Certainly not something my brother would use. I should have closed it then. Should have shut down the laptop and thrown it away. But I didn't. Instead, I opened that text file again and stared at those random characters. They were grouped in blocks, separated by line breaks. On a hunch, I copied the first block and pasted it into the search bar. The page that loaded was plain, just text on a dark background, links listed one after another with short descriptions. Some of it was what you'd expect, I suppose. Things being sold that you can't buy in normal places. Services being offered. But a lot of it didn't make sense to me. Just vague phrases and code words. I didn't click on anything, just scrolled down, feeling increasingly sick, wondering what on earth Danny had been doing here. Then I saw a link that made my stomach drop. The description was only 3 words. Escort Services, UK. I clicked it before I could talk myself out of it. The page that loaded was designed like an old classified ad site, the kind you don't see anymore. Posts listed by region, each one with a title and a short description. Most were London, some Manchester, Birmingham, a few other cities. And there, about halfway down the page, was one for reading. My hand was shaking when I clicked it. What came up looked like a profile. There were photos, though they were small and grainy, clearly taken to hide identifying details. A description that was clinical, transactional. Services offered, prices, contact information in the form of another one of those onion addresses. It felt seedy. That was the word that kept coming back to me. Cheap, miserable. The sort of thing you don't talk about. I told myself that was all it was. Something Danny had stumbled into because he was lonely and human, not because it meant anything worse. Just Danny being a lonely bloke doing something he was ashamed of. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. The photos, for one. When I looked closer, really looked, the backgrounds were all the same. Same walls, same furniture, same dim lighting. These weren't pictures from different people in different places. They were all taken in the same room. And the women in them looked wrong. Not wrong like obviously fake or Photoshop, but wrong like they didn't want to be there. Their eyes were flat. Their smiles didn't reach anywhere near their faces. I backed out of the page and went back to the main listings, started clicking through other posts, other regions. And the more I looked, the more I saw the same pattern. Same style of photos, same clinical descriptions, same dead-eyed expressions. This wasn't escorts advertising themselves. This was something else entirely. I spent hours down that rabbit hole, clicking from page to page, trying to understand what I was looking at. There were other sites linked from that first page, each one more disturbing than the last. One appeared to be reviews, people rating and commenting on experiences they'd had. The language they used was dehumanizing, casual, like they were discussing products they'd bought rather than people. Another site had requests, people describing what they were looking for in specific, horrifying detail. And then I found the messages. They were in a separate application on the laptop, something designed for encrypted communication. I almost missed it completely, but it was listed in Danny's recently used programs. When I opened it, there were only 2 conversations saved. The first was short, just a few messages back and forth with someone whose name showed up as a random string of numbers. Danny had asked about the reading post, asked if the person was still available, what the process was, whether it was safe. The responses were brief and businesslike. Instructions on where to send payment, how to arrange a meeting, what to expect. The second conversation was longer and it started about a week after the first one ended. Danny's first message in it was a question. He asked if the person he'd met was all right, asked if she needed help. The response was immediate and aggressive, telling him to forget what he'd seen and never contact them again. But Danny didn't stop. He sent another message, then another, said he knew what was happening, said he'd seen the fear in her eyes, heard her trying to speak to him in a language he didn't understand, said he couldn't just pretend everything was fine. The responses got more threatening, told him to mind his own business, told him he had no idea what he was involving himself in, told him that asking questions was dangerous for everyone involved, including the people he thought he was helping. Danny's final message in that conversation was sent on the 9th of February, 3 days before he disappeared. All it said was that he'd kept a record of everything and that if anything happened to him, people would know where to look. I felt cold reading that, properly cold, like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. I went back through his laptop with new urgency, looking for whatever record he'd kept. It took me nearly 2 hours, but eventually I found a hidden folder, password protected, but using the same combination as everything else. Inside were screenshots, dozens of them. Pages from those sites, profiles, conversations, everything. He documented all of it, and at the bottom of the folder was a document, a letter I suppose, though he'd never sent it to anyone. It was addressed to the police. In it, Danny explained everything. How he'd stumbled onto those sites whilst looking for something else. Something he was too embarrassed to specify. How he'd initially thought it was just illegal escort services, nothing more. How he'd met someone through one of the listings and realized immediately that something was very wrong. The woman had been terrified, he wrote. Could barely speak English, kept glancing at the door like she expected someone to burst in. When he'd tried to talk to her, tried to ask if she needed help, she'd just shaken her head frantically and begged him to leave. He'd left, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. So he'd gone back online and started digging deeper. I didn't understand it all at once. It was more like a pressure building at the back of my head, the sense that I was seeing the same thing over and over again from slightly different angles. He didn't call it a network at first. He kept using words like overlap and coincidence, like he was trying to talk himself out of what he was seeing. Only later did he start writing as if he'd accepted it, that the same names, rooms and faces kept resurfacing for a reason. Danny thought he'd worked out locations, addresses that kept cropping up in different forms, sometimes hinted at, sometimes almost spelled out. He wasn't certain. He wrote that more than once, but the patterns bothered him enough that he couldn't ignore them. He'd noted patterns in the posts, worked out which profiles seemed to move between different cities, cross-referenced reviews to build up a picture of who was running things. It was all there in his notes, detailed and careful and absolutely damning. The letter ended with him saying he was going to the police, that he'd gathered enough evidence, that he couldn't sit on it any longer, that someone needed to do something, but he'd never sent it. And 3 days later, he was gone. I sat there with his laptop on my knees, feeling like the walls were closing in. I knew what had happened. I knew it with absolute certainty. I don't have proof of what happened after that. I don't have a body or a confession or anything neat like that. But reading those messages, seeing how they changed once he wouldn't back off, it felt impossible to believe his disappearance was a coincidence. I thought about going to the police myself, thought about taking the laptop, showing them everything, making them listen. But then I thought about Danny's final message, about how he'd told them he had insurance, a record that would come out if anything happened to him, and how they'd taken him anyway. They knew he'd documented everything, which meant they'd come looking for it, looking for the laptop, the files, the evidence. And when they didn't find it in his flat, when the police didn't mention it, they must have assumed it was still out there somewhere, that someone had it. If I went to the police now, 3 years later, with this laptop and these files, what would happen? Best case, they'd investigate, maybe arrest some people, maybe shut down part of the operation. But the people at the top, the ones who'd made Danny disappear, they'd know where the evidence had come from. They'd know his family had been digging. They'd know about me. I thought about Mum and Dad, about how they'd already lost Danny, about how destroyed they'd be if something happened to me too. And I thought about the women in those photos, the ones with the dead eyes and the forced smiles, and how going to the police might help them, but might also make everything worse, might drive the whole operation further underground, make the people running it more careful, more brutal. I don't know if I made the right choice. I've questioned it every day since. I deleted everything, every file, every screenshot, every trace of what Danny had found, wiped the laptop completely and took it to a recycling center 3 towns over. Told Mum and Dad I hadn't found anything useful on it, just some old work documents and pictures of his mates. They believed me because why wouldn't they? But I kept one thing, just one screenshot, buried in an encrypted folder on my own laptop. One of the profiles Danny had documented, not because I know what to do with it, but because I couldn't bring myself to erase it all completely. Couldn't let what he'd found just disappear into nothing. Sometimes I look at it, not often, but sometimes. I zoom in on the faces in the background of those photos, the glimpses of rooms and windows, and I try to work out where they might be. I tell myself that one day I'll be brave enough to do something with it, to finish what Danny started. But I know I won't. I'm not brave like he was. I'm just scared. The worst part is the not knowing for certain. The police say he's a missing person, probably went off somewhere to start fresh, probably had some kind of breakdown we didn't know about. Mum half believes it sometimes, on her better days. Dad just looks tired whenever it comes up. And I sit there at family dinners, picking at my food, knowing they took him, knowing he's not coming back, knowing I could tell the truth but choosing not to, because I'm too frightened of what might happen. I see his face sometimes, in crowds or across the street, and my heart stops for just a second before I realize it's not him. Could never be him. Because wherever Danny is now, whatever they did to him, when they realized he was going to expose them, he's gone. Has been for 3 years. And the women in those photos, they're probably still there, still in those rooms with the same walls and the same dim lighting, still being advertised on sites most people don't even know exist, still waiting for someone to be brave enough to help them. Danny tried. He really did try, and it got him killed or disappeared, or whatever term makes it easier to swallow. I think about that last message he sent sometimes, about how he told them he'd kept a record, how he thought that would protect him, about how wrong he was. And I wonder if somewhere, in whatever hell they put him through before the end, he regretted getting involved at all, regretted not just closing that laptop and walking away like any sensible person would have done. I regret it for him. Regret that he had a conscience, that he cared, that he thought one person could make a difference against people who make other people disappear without a trace. But mostly, I regret being such a coward. I regret deleting the files more than I regret anything else I've ever done. Not because it haunts me, but because I know exactly why I did it. I tell myself it's what Danny would have wanted, that he wouldn't want Mum and Dad to lose both their children, that he'd understand why I made the choice I did. But I don't think he would. I think he'd be disappointed in me, and I think he'd be right to be. So that's my confession, I suppose. My brother found something terrible on the dark web, tried to do the right thing, and disappeared because of it. And I found the evidence that could explain what happened to him, maybe even help the people he was trying to save. And I destroyed it because I was too scared to do anything else. The police are still looking, technically. Mum still shares his photo. Dad still goes quiet when anyone mentions his name. And I still check the news sometimes, looking for stories about trafficking raids or missing persons found or operations shut down, hoping that somehow, without me doing anything, someone else will stumble onto what Danny found and actually have the courage to act on it. But deep down, I know that's not going to happen. Deep down, I know those women are still there, still trapped, still waiting. And I know Danny's gone, and nothing I do now will bring him back. I just have to live with that. Live with knowing the truth and doing nothing about it. Live with being the person who chose safety over justice. I don't sleep well anymore. I haven't in 3 years. I don't think I ever will again. I messed up. I know I did. And there's no point pretending otherwise. What started as curiosity about a strange advertisement has left me looking over my shoulder every time I leave my house, checking faces in crowds, wondering which of my neighbors knows more about me than they should. I work as a copywriter for a marketing agency in Manchester, the kind of job that involves writing product descriptions and website content for clients who rarely appreciate the effort that goes into making their beige services sound interesting. It pays the bills, and I can do most of it from home, which suited me fine since I've always preferred my own company to office politics. The whole thing started when I was researching competitor websites for a client presentation. I'd been looking at various classified advertisement sites, seeing how other businesses positioned their services, what kind of language worked, that sort of thing. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Second-hand furniture, cars for sale, people offering gardening services or dog walking. Then I found a listing that didn't quite fit. It was on a legitimate classified site, one of the larger ones that's been around for years. The listing was in the property section, but instead of advertising a flat or house for rent, it simply said, "Viewing available," with an address in Salford and a date the following week. No rental price, no description of the property, no contact details, just those 2 words and a time slot. I probably wouldn't have paid much attention to it, except the address looked familiar. It took me a moment to place it, but I eventually realized it was the street where my mate Rob used to live before he moved to Bristol. I'd been to his old flat several times for dinner or to watch football, and I was fairly certain I remembered the specific house number. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I clicked through to see if there were any other details. The listing had been posted anonymously, with no user profile or history attached. The description field was completely blank, except for a reference number composed of random letters and numbers. It had been viewed around 30 times, which seemed low for a property listing, but high for something so vague and uninformative. I searched for the reference number online, thinking it might lead to a proper listing elsewhere with more information. What I found instead was a discussion on an obscure message board, where someone had asked if anyone knew what these types of listings meant. The responses were unhelpful and vague, with most people dismissing it as a posting error or spam. One person suggested it might be code for something, but didn't elaborate on what. The more I looked at that listing, the stranger it seemed. Why would someone post a viewing time for a property without any actual property information? Who would respond to such a vague advertisement? And why did the address have to be a place I recognized? I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Probably just someone who'd messed up their listing and forgotten to include the crucial details. But the coincidence of it being Rob's old address bothered me enough that I sent him a message asking if he knew anything about the current occupants or if the place was up for rent. Rob replied saying he had no idea who lived there now and hadn't kept in touch with anyone from that street. He'd moved out nearly 2 years ago and hadn't been back since. The landlord who'd owned his flat had been selling up properties around that time, so it could be under new ownership entirely. I should have left it there. I had work to do, the client presentation to prepare, no legitimate reason to spend more time thinking about a badly written property listing. But something about it nagged at me over the next few days. I found myself checking the listing repeatedly, seeing if any details had been added or if it had been taken down. It stayed up, unchanged, until the date mentioned in the original post. That evening, I checked one final time and found the listing had been removed. In its place, posted by the same anonymous account, was a new listing. Another address in Manchester, another viewing available heading, another date the following week. This address I didn't recognize, but the format was identical to the first one. I started searching for similar listings, curious if this was part of some pattern. Over the next hour, I found 5 more scattered across the site, all posted within the past month, all following the same minimal format. Different addresses across Greater Manchester, different dates, but the same mysterious reference numbers and complete lack of property details. What made me genuinely uneasy was discovering that one of the addresses was for a house 3 streets away from my own flat. I'd walked past it countless times, a standard terraced house indistinguishable from dozens of others in the area. The listing gave a viewing time for 2 days later, midday on a Thursday. I knew I was probably being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong about these listings. The coincidence of one being so close to where I lived, combined with the earlier one being at Rob's old address, seemed too specific to be random. On the Thursday, I did something I'm not proud of. I walked down to that street at the time mentioned in the listing and watched the house from a distance. I told myself I was just satisfying my curiosity, that I'd see it was a perfectly normal property viewing and could forget about the whole thing. What I actually saw was 3 people arriving separately over the course of about 20 minutes. None of them looked like typical house hunters. They didn't peer through windows or check the property's exterior. They simply walked up to the front door, which opened before they could knock, and went inside. Each person stayed for maybe 10 minutes before leaving, walking away quickly without looking back. I couldn't see who answered the door from where I was standing, and I didn't get close enough to hear any conversations. But something about the whole interaction felt wrong. The brevity of each visit, the way the door opened before they knocked as though they were expected, the lack of any normal viewing behavior like taking photos or discussing the property. That evening, I made a decision that changed everything. I went back to that classified site and searched for the reference number format I'd noticed on all those strange listings. It took some trial and error, but I eventually found a way to pull up a list of similar postings going back several months. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all following the same pattern. Addresses across the UK, viewing times, nothing else. I selected a few at random and searched for the addresses on Google Street View, trying to understand what these properties had in common. They were ordinary residential streets, a mix of terraced houses, semi-detached properties, and low-rise flat buildings. Nothing obviously connected them, except that they all existed, and all had these mysterious listings attached to them. Then I found one listing that included slightly more information than the others. Below the standard viewing available heading, someone had added a website address, not a normal URL, but one of those long strings of random characters that indicated a dark web site, accessible only through specific software. I spent the next few hours reading about how to access these hidden websites, feeling increasingly like I was crossing a line I shouldn't. But I needed to know what connected all these addresses, what these viewings were actually for. The dark web address was clearly the answer, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to see it. The process of accessing that website was simpler than I'd expected, though it felt transgressive in a way that regular internet browsing never does. The knowledge that I was looking at content deliberately hidden from search engines and normal browsers made everything feel more significant and dangerous. The website itself was professionally designed, organized like a property portal, but with a distinctly unsettling atmosphere. Instead of estate agent listings, it displayed addresses organized by region and date. Each entry included the same minimal information I'd seen on the classified site: an address, a reference number, a time slot. But this version included additional details that hadn't appeared in the public listings. Each address had a detailed description, but not of the property. Instead, it described the current occupants, their approximate age, their work schedules, whether they lived alone, what time they typically left and returned home. One listing mentioned that the occupant worked from home most days, but went to a gym 3 evenings a week. Another noted that the resident usually took their bins out on Tuesday evenings and received grocery deliveries on Saturday mornings. These weren't property viewings. They were opportunities to access occupied homes when specific information suggested it would be safe to do so. The reference numbers corresponded to different levels of access or different purposes, though I couldn't decode the full system from what I was seeing. Worst of all, I found my own address, listed with today's date and a time slot in 2 hours, when I was supposedly at my regular Thursday evening circuit training class at the local leisure centre. The description noted that I lived alone, worked from home, and typically spent Thursday evenings out of the flat between 7 and 9. It mentioned which window I usually left slightly open for ventilation, and which security light at the building entrance was broken. Someone had been watching me, documenting my routine, selling access to my home to whoever wanted it. That first listing at Rob's old address hadn't been coincidence. It had been a test to see if I'd notice, if I'd investigate, if I'd lead myself to exactly where I was now. I don't know how long they'd been watching me, or what had happened during those Thursday evenings when I was reliably absent. I thought about all the times I'd come home to find small things out of place. A drawer not quite closed, a book moved slightly on the shelf. I'd always attributed it to my own forgetfulness, never imagining someone had been inside while I was doing circuits in a fluorescent lit sports hall. I contacted the police immediately, showing them everything I'd found. They took it seriously, which somehow made it worse. It meant I wasn't being paranoid, that this was a real and recognized threat. They explained these schemes had become increasingly common, with people gathering information about residents and selling access to homes for purposes ranging from theft to far worse. They checked my flat and found evidence someone had been entering regularly, small scratches around the lock that I'd never noticed, suggesting it had been picked multiple times. A tiny camera hidden in the smoke detector that had been recording and transmitting for weeks. Fingerprints that didn't match mine on surfaces I knew I'd cleaned. The police arrested 2 people the following week, caught entering a house across Manchester that had been listed on that same dark website. But the website itself continued operating, moving to new addresses, listing new homes. My own listing was removed, But that didn't undo the weeks or months someone had been accessing my flat, photographing my possessions, recording my routine. I moved out within the month, though I know that doesn't really solve anything. My new address isn't listed yet, but that just means yet. I've learned to check those classified sites regularly, searching for my new postcode, looking for any sign that someone started watching again. I've installed proper security, changed all my locks, covered my windows with blackout curtains even though I hate how dark it makes the rooms. But mostly, I've learned that privacy is an illusion maintained only as long as you're not interesting enough for someone to violate it. Your home is secure only until someone decides it isn't. Your routine is private only until someone finds it worth documenting. And once that information exists somewhere online, once your address appears in those listings, you can never be completely certain you're truly alone in your own home. I still check that dark website sometimes, searching through the listings, wondering about all those other addresses. How many people are living in homes currently being accessed by strangers? How many have noticed small things out of place, but convinced themselves they were imagining it? How many would find their own address listed if they knew where to look? The classified site still hosts those mysterious viewing listings hidden among the legitimate advertisements for furniture and cars. They're still there, still posted by anonymous accounts, still directing people to addresses across the country. And somewhere behind each one is a person who has no idea their home has been categorized, described, and made available for viewing by whoever can decode the reference numbers and access the right websites. That's what keeps me awake now. Not just what happened to me, but the knowledge of how many others it's happening to right now. The woman 3 streets away whose listing mentioned she worked late on Wednesdays. The elderly man in Bolton whose entry noted he was hard of hearing and went to bed by 9. The family in Leeds whose schedule was documented down to which days the children had after-school activities. All those addresses, all those lives, all that private information gathered and sold in hidden corners of the internet where normal people would never think to look. And I found it by accident, following a curiosity that seemed harmless at the time, but led me to discover exactly how vulnerable we all are. I messed up by investigating those listings in the first place, but I'm still not sure if I'd make a different choice, because now I know the truth. Uncomfortable as it is, now I understand that the locks on our doors and the routines we think are private are only as secure as we are invisible. And in a world where information has value, none of us are invisible enough. I've been trying to work out when exactly I should have stopped, you know? At what point did this stop being a bit of harmless curiosity and turn into something I should have walked away from? I lie awake some nights, replaying it all, wondering if I'm the sort of person who is always capable of ignoring the obvious warning signs, or if desperation just has a way of making you blind to things you'd normally see clear as day. I used to manage property listings for a lettings agency in Sheffield. Nothing glamorous, just photographing flats and writing descriptions for rental websites. But then someone offered me money to do similar work for properties that weren't exactly available through normal channels, and I convinced myself it was all legitimate because I needed to believe it was. I'm staying with my sister in Glasgow now, as far from Sheffield as I could reasonably get without leaving the country, and I still don't feel safe because I finally understand what those listings were really for, what I was helping these people do, and I know they won't be happy that I've worked it out. The whole thing started about 10 months ago when the lettings agency I worked for went into administration. One day, I'm photographing a 3-bedroom terrace in Hillsborough. The next, I'm being told they can't make payroll, and we're all being let go with immediate effect. I was 42 years old, with a mortgage and no savings to speak of. Watching my entire career disappear overnight, I tried finding similar work with other agencies, but the property market was going through one of its periodic collapses, and nobody was hiring. I signed on at the job center and started applying for anything that seemed remotely suitable, but weeks turned into months with nothing but rejection emails and silence. That's when I got the message through a professional networking site. Someone had seen my portfolio of property photography and was interested in commissioning similar work for a private client. The rate they offered was nearly double what I'd been earning at the agency. £1,500 per property, paid immediately upon completion. I should have been suspicious about why anyone would pay such generous rates for basic property photography, but I was desperate enough to overlook the obvious questions. The client explained they represented overseas investors who needed detailed documentation of UK properties for their portfolio assessments. The first assignment seemed straightforward enough. I was given an address in Rotherham, a modest, semi-detached house in a quiet residential area, and asked to photograph the exterior and, if possible, gather information about the interior layout. The client provided specific requirements about camera angles, lighting conditions, even particular features they wanted documented. When I arrived at the property, I quickly realized this wasn't a house that was for sale or rent. There were curtains in the windows, a car in the driveway, even children's toys scattered in the front garden. This was someone's home, and I was being paid to photograph it without the occupant's knowledge or consent. I almost walked away then, but the client had paid half the fee upfront, and I'd already spent most of it on overdue bills. So I convinced myself I was just taking photographs from a public street. Nothing technically illegal about documenting buildings that anyone could see. I took the exterior shots as requested, making sure to capture all the angles and features the client had specified. Then I walked around to the back alley and photographed the rear of the property as well, noting the security arrangements and access points as the brief had requested. When I submitted the photographs, the client was pleased with my work and paid the remaining fee immediately. They also offered me another assignment for the following week, a different property in Doncaster with similar requirements. Over the next few months, I photographed dozens of properties across South Yorkshire. All of them were occupied homes rather than properties for sale, and all required the same detailed documentation of security features, access points, and daily activity observations. The assignments came with increasingly specific requirements. I was asked to note what time residents left for work, whether they had security systems or dogs, even to identify which windows were typically left open during warm weather. The client claimed this information helped their investors assess neighborhood security and property maintenance standards. But I was starting to understand that I wasn't documenting properties for investment purposes. I was conducting surveillance for people who intended to break into these homes. The detailed information I was gathering would allow burglars to identify vulnerable properties, plan their approach, and minimize the risk of being caught. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that there were innocent explanations for why overseas investors might need such detailed security assessments. But the evidence was mounting that I'd been recruited to provide reconnaissance for organized crime. The breakthrough came when I was assigned to photograph a property in Chapeltown. The house was a neat bungalow occupied by an elderly couple who I'd occasionally see tending their garden when I drove past during my surveillance work. The client's brief was more detailed than usual. They wanted photographs documenting the couple's daily routine, the times when the property was empty, even close-up shots showing the type of locks on the doors and windows. This wasn't property assessment. It was target reconnaissance for people planning to victimize vulnerable elderly residents. I couldn't ignore what I was really doing anymore. I'd been providing intelligence that enabled criminals to identify and exploit the most vulnerable members of our community. Every photograph I'd taken, every security assessment I'd compiled, had probably contributed to someone's home being burgled. But I couldn't just stop accepting assignments without facing serious consequences. I'd become financially dependent on the income, and the client had made it clear they valued discretion above all else. People who cause problems for their operation might face difficulties of their own. I started keeping detailed records of all my assignments, documenting which properties I'd surveilled and what information I'd provided. I told myself I was preserving evidence in case I needed to cooperate with law enforcement. But really, I was just trying to feel less guilty about what I was doing. That's when I discovered the client wasn't just commissioning surveillance from me. They were coordinating dozens of reconnaissance operatives across the country, building a comprehensive database of vulnerable properties and their security arrangements. The operation used hidden internet channels to coordinate activities and share intelligence. I only discovered this because the client sent me login credentials to access their secure communication system, apparently deciding I was trustworthy enough to participate in their wider operations. What I found when I accessed their system was more sophisticated and extensive than I'd imagined. They had detailed profiles of thousands of properties across the UK, all compiled by operatives like me who'd been recruited to conduct surveillance work. The properties were categorized by vulnerability factors: elderly occupants, single parents, families with young children, even specific details about medical conditions or disabilities that might make residents less able to defend their homes. This wasn't opportunistic burglary. It was systematic targeting of the most defenseless members of society. Each property listing included comprehensive intelligence gathered from multiple sources. My photographs and observations were combined with information from other operatives who'd posed as utility workers, charity collectors, even care service providers, to gain access to homes and assess their contents. Some listings included floor plans sketched by people who'd been inside the properties, detailed inventories of valuable items, even assessments of residents' psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited during home invasions. The operation was treating burglary like a business enterprise, with professional standards and systematic intelligence gathering. They'd industrialized home invasion, creating an efficient system for identifying targets, planning approaches, and maximizing the value extracted from each crime. But what really disturbed me was discovering that some of the listings weren't just for burglary. Certain properties were marked with special designations that indicated they'd been selected for more serious criminal activity. I found discussions among the operatives about properties that could be used for other purposes once the residents had been driven out through harassment or intimidation. Homes that might be suitable for illegal operations, properties in strategic locations that could be taken over by criminals once the legitimate occupants had been sufficiently terrorized. One thread discussed an elderly woman in Barnsley whose home had been repeatedly burgled until she'd agreed to move into a care facility. The property was then rented to criminals who used it as a base for drug dealing, with the original owner having no idea her former home was being exploited for illegal purposes. Another discussion focused on a family in Meadowhall who'd been subjected to escalating harassment until they'd sold their house at below market value. The property had been purchased through a front company and was now being used for purposes the operatives wouldn't specify in their online communications. I realized I'd been part of an operation that went far beyond simple burglary. These people were systematically identifying and exploiting vulnerable residents, not just stealing their possessions, but driving them from their homes and taking over the properties for criminal enterprises. The surveillance work I'd been doing wasn't just enabling individual crimes. It was facilitating a form of domestic terrorism that destroyed people's lives and communities. Every property I documented was potentially being targeted not just for theft, but for systematic harassment, designed to drive out legitimate residents. I started researching the properties I'd surveilled, checking local news reports and crime statistics to see what had happened after I'd submitted my intelligence. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Many of the properties had been burgled within weeks of my surveillance work, often multiple times in quick succession. The burglaries showed intimate knowledge of the residents' routines and security arrangements, suggesting they'd been planned using the intelligence I had provided. But some properties had experienced worse than simple burglary. Several families had been subjected to sustained harassment campaigns that seemed designed to force them to relocate. Vandalism, threatening behavior, even violent confrontations that escalated until the residents felt they had no choice but to move away. A few properties had been taken over entirely after the original occupants had left. Criminals had moved in and established operations that turned quiet residential streets into centers for drug dealing, prostitution, and other illegal activities. I was looking at a systematic campaign to destabilize working-class communities by driving out vulnerable residents and replacing them with criminal enterprises. My surveillance work had been part of a coordinated effort to hollow out neighborhoods and create spaces where organized crime could operate with minimal interference. The elderly couple in Chapeltown, whose home I'd surveilled, were among the victims. They'd been burgled twice in the space of a month, losing possessions that had sentimental rather than financial value. The second burglary had traumatized them so badly they'd moved in with their daughter, leaving their home empty and vulnerable. I checked the property listing system and saw their house had been marked as vacant and available for criminal use. Someone was planning to take advantage of the empty property, probably using it for illegal operations, while the elderly couple paid the mortgage on a home they were too frightened to return to. That's when I realized I couldn't continue being part of this operation, regardless of the financial or personal consequences. I'd been helping to destroy communities and victimize the most vulnerable people in society, all because I'd been too desperate and too cowardly to walk away when I should have. I tried contacting the police to report what I'd discovered, but explaining the technical aspects of the operation proved more complicated than I'd expected. The officer I spoke to seemed confused by my descriptions of hidden internet channels and coordinated criminal intelligence gathering. They took a statement and promised to investigate, but I could tell they were overwhelmed by the scope of what I was describing. Organized crime operations using sophisticated technology to coordinate activities across multiple regions weren't something local police felt equipped to handle. I was advised to stop accepting surveillance assignments and avoid further contact with the criminal operation. The officer suggested I might be called as a witness if they managed to build a case against the organizers, but warned me not to expect quick results given the complexity of the investigation. That advice would have been more useful if I hadn't already made myself a target by asking too many questions about the operation's broader activities. The criminals I'd been working for had been monitoring my access to their communication systems, and they'd noticed my sudden interest in properties I hadn't personally surveilled. I started receiving messages warning me to mind my own business and focus on my assigned surveillance work. The tone was polite but firm, making it clear that curiosity about the operation's wider activities wasn't appreciated. When I ignored these warnings and continued investigating what happened to the properties I documented, the messages became more explicit. I was told that people who cause problems for the operation had a tendency to experience problems of their own, and it would be unfortunate if I found myself in a similar situation. That's when I noticed I was being watched. Cars following me when I drove to surveillance assignments, people photographing me from across the street, even evidence that someone had been through my flat while I was out working. I found my own details posted on the same hidden communication system I'd been using to access the property listings. My home address, my daily routine, even a floor plan of my flat that someone had obviously sketched after gaining access while I was away. The message was clear. I was now a target myself, subject to the same surveillance and intelligence gathering I'd been conducting against others. They were demonstrating that they could reach me anywhere, that they knew intimate details about my life, and that I was just as vulnerable as the elderly couples and single parents I'd been helping them victimize. The surveillance escalated quickly after that. My flat was broken into while I was at the supermarket, though nothing was stolen. Someone wanted me to know they could access my home whenever they chose, that my locks and security measures meant nothing against people who had professional expertise in circumventing such protections. I started finding evidence of their intrusions everywhere. Personal belongings moved slightly out of position, computer files accessed and deleted, even photographs of me sleeping that had been left on my bedside table as a threat. The psychological impact was worse than any physical harm. I couldn't sleep knowing that strangers were entering my home while I was unconscious and vulnerable. I couldn't relax knowing that I was being watched and documented with the same systematic precision I'd applied to surveillance of others. I reported the break-ins to the police, but without evidence of theft or damage. They treated it as low-priority harassment rather than serious criminal activity. They suggested I improve my home security, apparently unaware that I was being targeted by professionals who could circumvent any reasonable security measures. That's when I realized I needed to leave Sheffield entirely. The surveillance operation knew where I lived, where I worked, even where I shopped and socialized. I couldn't escape their attention while remaining in a city where they had extensive resources and intelligence gathering capabilities. I packed essential belongings and drove to Glasgow to stay with my sister, leaving behind most of my possessions and my entire life in Sheffield. I told my sister I needed a change of scene after losing my job, not wanting to burden her with the truth about what I'd been involved with. But even here in Glasgow, several hundred miles from Sheffield, I don't feel entirely safe. The surveillance operation extends across the country, with operatives in every major city conducting reconnaissance work for criminals who treat home invasion as a professional enterprise. I keep checking the hidden communication system I still have access to, monitoring whether my details have been flagged for targeting by operatives in Scotland. So far, I haven't found any specific threats, but I know that could change at any moment. The worst part is knowing that the operation continues without me. Other desperate people are being recruited to conduct surveillance work, probably telling themselves the same lies I did about legitimate property assessment and overseas investors. The properties I documented are still being targeted for burglary and harassment. The elderly couples and vulnerable families I helped identify are still being victimized by criminals who use the intelligence I provided to plan their attacks. I keep thinking about that couple in Chapeltown who are too frightened to return to their own home after being burgled twice in a month. About the family in Meadowhall who sold their house at a loss because the harassment became unbearable. About all the other victims whose lives I helped destroy because I was too desperate for money to ask the obvious questions about what I was really doing. The surveillance operation has probably moved on to recruiting new operatives by now, finding other unemployed property professionals who are desperate enough to accept generous payment for documenting homes without asking why anyone would pay such rates for simple photography work. And somewhere in South Yorkshire, criminals are probably using the intelligence I gathered to plan their next burglary or harassment campaign, breaking into homes where elderly residents live alone, targeting families with young children, driving vulnerable people from their properties so the homes can be exploited for illegal purposes. I suppose I'm telling you this because I need someone to understand how these operations recruit ordinary people, how they exploit financial desperation to make us complicit in serious crimes, and how they're systematically destroying communities across the country. If you're ever approached with offers that seem too generous for simple work, if someone wants to pay you to photograph properties or gather information about residents, please walk away immediately. Don't make the same mistake I did by convincing yourself it's legitimate, because you need to believe it is. Because once you're involved with these operations, once you understand what they're really doing and who they're targeting, you can't unknow what you've learned. You become a liability they need to manage, a potential threat they need to monitor and control. And if you cause them enough problems, if you try to expose their activities or interfere with their operations, you might find yourself on the receiving end of the same surveillance and harassment you helped inflict on others. I'm living with that fear every day now, wondering if they've decided I'm enough of a threat to warrant more serious attention, wondering if the next property listing I see on their communication system will include my sister's address here in Glasgow. The operation taught me that privacy is an illusion, that home security means nothing against determined professionals, and that anyone can become a target if they threaten the wrong people's criminal enterprises. But most of all, it taught me that financial desperation can make you capable of things you never imagined you'd do, that the desire to pay your bills and keep your home can override your moral judgment until you're complicit in the systematic victimization of innocent people. I can't undo the damage I helped cause, can't restore the sense of security I helped destroy for dozens of families across South Yorkshire. All I can do is hope that someone with more resources and authority will eventually dismantle these operations before they destroy more communities and ruin more lives. And hope that my sister never asks why I jump every time I hear a car door close outside, or why I check the locks 3 times before going to bed, or why I can't seem to settle into normal life here in Glasgow, despite being several hundred miles from the people who turned me into both a criminal and a victim. About 2 years ago, when things weren't going particularly well in my life, someone suggested finding an online support group. It seemed like reasonable advice at the time, a way to connect with people dealing with similar issues, get some perspective from others who'd been through what I was going through. Nothing dramatic or unusual, just the kind of thing people do nowadays when they need help and don't quite know where else to turn. The group I eventually found seemed perfect, welcoming, supportive, full of people who understood exactly what I was dealing with. It felt genuine, like I'd stumbled across something really valuable during a difficult period. Looking back now, I suppose there were small things that should have made me question it. But when you're vulnerable and someone's offering understanding, you don't tend to look too closely at the details. And that's the problem really, because it wasn't a support group at all. It was a data collection operation targeting vulnerable people, and everything I shared there over 3 months, my fears, my routines, my personal struggles, was compiled into a profile that's been sold more times than I can count to people who see emotional vulnerability as something worth exploiting. I'm a pharmacy assistant working in Plymouth. Been doing it for around 9 years now. It's steady work, dealing with prescriptions and customer queries. Nothing particularly stressful under normal circumstances. But 2 years ago, I went through a difficult divorce that left me struggling with anxiety and insomnia. I'd wake at 3 in the morning with my mind racing, unable to settle, feeling isolated and overwhelmed by changes in my life I hadn't chosen and couldn't control. My GP prescribed some medication for the anxiety and suggested counseling, which helped to a degree. But what I really wanted was to talk to people who'd been through similar experiences, who understood the specific challenges of rebuilding life after a marriage ends. Professional therapy felt formal and clinical. I wanted something more personal, more immediate, the kind of peer support that comes from shared experience rather than professional expertise. I found the group through a recommendation on a women's health website. It was called Moving Forward Together, described as a safe space for women recovering from relationship breakdowns. The website looked professional and compassionate, with testimonials from members who'd found comfort and practical advice through the community. There was a simple registration process requiring an email address and some basic information about your situation. Then you'd receive login details to access the private discussion area. I registered one evening when I couldn't sleep, filled out a form explaining I was recovering from divorce and struggling with anxiety and insomnia. Within hours, I received a welcome email with instructions for accessing the group's discussion platform. It was set up like a private social network, with message boards for different topics, member profiles, and direct messaging capabilities. The group seemed genuinely supportive. There were around 50 active members, all women apparently going through or recovering from relationship difficulties. They shared stories about their experiences, offered advice about practical matters like finances and childcare arrangements, provided emotional support during difficult moments. The tone was warm and understanding, exactly the kind of community I'd been hoping to find. I started participating regularly, posting about my struggles with anxiety and sleep, responding to others who were dealing with similar issues. People were kind and empathetic, sharing their own experiences and suggesting things that had helped them. One woman recommended specific relaxation techniques that she'd found useful. Another suggested herbal remedies that had helped her sleep. A third shared details about how she'd managed the financial challenges of living alone after years of shared expenses. The group felt safe enough that I found myself sharing quite personal information, details about my daily routine and how anxiety was affecting my work, specific fears about being alone that made me hypervigilant about home security, information about my financial situation and concerns about managing on a single income. The kind of vulnerable honesty that comes from feeling understood by people in similar circumstances. One aspect of the group that seemed particularly helpful was a feature called Accountability Partners. You could request to be matched with another member for more private one-to-one support, someone you'd check in with regularly to share progress and challenges. I was matched with a woman who called herself Sarah, who'd apparently been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier and was now helping newer members navigate their own recovery. Sarah and I messaged frequently, sometimes daily. She asked detailed questions about my situation, always framing them as genuine interest in helping me work through challenges. What specific aspects of living alone made me most anxious? What times of day did I feel most vulnerable? Did I have family nearby who could provide support? What were my work hours like? And how did that affect my ability to manage household responsibilities alone? I answered all her questions honestly, grateful for someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding my situation. I told her about my morning routine and how I'd struggled to get motivated to leave for work, about coming home to an empty house in the evenings and feeling the absence of another person more acutely then. about lying awake at night, worrying about things I'd never worried about when I wasn't living alone, unusual sounds outside, whether doors and windows were properly secured, whether anyone knew I was by myself. Sarah would respond with understanding and practical advice. She'd share similar experiences from her own recovery, suggest specific strategies for managing anxiety, ask follow-up questions that showed she was really listening and thinking about my situation. It felt like genuine friendship developing, the kind of connection that helps you feel less alone during difficult times. After about 3 months of active participation in the group, I started feeling better. The anxiety was more manageable, I was sleeping more consistently, and life as a single person was becoming normal rather than frightening. I participated less frequently in the group discussions, not because I was unhappy with the community, but because I simply needed it less. I check in occasionally, but mostly I was moving forward with my life, which was the entire point. Then, about 6 months after I'd largely stopped participating, I received an email from someone claiming to be a journalist investigating online support groups. She explained that she'd found evidence that moving forward together wasn't what it appeared to be, and she was trying to contact former members to warn them about what their personal information might have been used for. I was skeptical at first, thinking it might be spam or some kind of scam, but the journalist provided specific details about the group that convinced me she was legitimate. She explained that moving forward together was operated by people who specialized in gathering detailed personal information from vulnerable individuals, information that could be used for various forms of exploitation, including targeted fraud, stalking, and burglary. She discovered this whilst investigating a series of burglaries targeting single women, all of whom had at some point participated in online support groups for relationship recovery. The pattern had been subtle enough that police hadn't initially connected the cases, but the journalist had noticed similarities in how the victims had been selected and the timing of when they were targeted. The journalist had managed to gain access to back-end systems used by the people running Moving Forward Together, and what she found was disturbing. The group wasn't a genuine support community. It was a sophisticated information-gathering operation designed to extract detailed personal information from emotionally vulnerable women under the guise of peer support and friendship. Every post made in the group was being analyzed and compiled into individual member profiles. The direct messages, the accountability partnerships, the private conversations where members shared their most vulnerable moments, all of it was being recorded and organized into comprehensive dossiers about each participant's life, fears, routines, and circumstances. My profile included everything I'd shared over those 3 months, my work schedule at the pharmacy and typical routines, my home address, which I'd mentioned in context of discussing my neighborhood and feeling isolated there, detailed information about my anxiety triggers and specific fears about living alone, notes about my financial situation and what valuables I owned, even analysis of my sleeping patterns and what times I was most likely to be home versus away. But the profile also included information I'd never shared directly, analysis based on what I'd written, inferences about my psychology and behavior, assessments of my vulnerability to different types of exploitation, notes indicating I was particularly susceptible to authority figures and likely to comply with demands from people presenting themselves as official or helpful, observations about my tendency to trust people who seemed understanding and supportive. The journalist showed me screenshots of the dark web marketplace where these profiles were being sold. It was organized like a database of vulnerable targets, searchable by location, living situation, specific vulnerabilities, and types of exploitable information available. My profile was listed under single women in the Plymouth area with documented anxiety and security concerns. The listing emphasized the quality and detail of information available. It highlighted that I'd willingly shared intimate details about my fears and routines, that I'd been open about my financial situation and possessions, that I'd documented specific times when I was home alone and feeling most vulnerable. All of this was presented as valuable intelligence for anyone interested in targeting me for fraud, burglary, stalking, or other forms of exploitation. The purchase history showed my profile had been bought by 8 different accounts over the past 18 months. 8 separate people or organizations had paid money for comprehensive information about my personal life, my vulnerabilities, my routines, my fears. The marketplace didn't reveal buyer identities, but the journalist had been working with police to try to trace some transactions and identify who was purchasing these profiles. What made it particularly insidious was how the information had been gathered. I hadn't been tricked into sharing personal details through obvious phishing or fraud. I'd voluntarily provided everything, believing I was participating in a genuine support community, trusting that my vulnerability would be met with compassion rather than exploitation. The entire operation was built on weaponizing the instinct to seek help and connection during difficult times. The journalist had identified around 200 women whose profiles were being sold through the same marketplace, all of them having participated in various online support groups operated by the same organization. Groups for relationship recovery, bereavement support, health anxiety, financial stress. Any community where people were likely to share detailed personal information while seeking help and understanding. Several women whose profiles had been purchased had subsequently been victims of crimes. Burglaries timed to occur when they were reliably away from home. Sophisticated fraud attempts targeting their specific financial vulnerabilities. Stalking by individuals who'd used the profiles to learn their routines and locations. The journalist had documented around 15 cases where profile purchases correlated clearly with subsequent victimization. I contacted the police after speaking with the journalist. They were already investigating the operation based on information she'd provided, and they took detailed statements from me about my participation in the group and what I'd shared. They explained that prosecuting these cases was complicated because the information had been voluntarily provided. Even though the context was deceptive, the act of compiling and selling the information might be illegal, but proving that members had been deliberately deceived required demonstrating the group's true purpose. A detective showed me more details about how the operation worked. The people running it had created dozens of different support groups covering various life challenges. Each group appeared independent, with different branding and website designs, but they were all operated by the same organization, collecting information for the same marketplace. The accountability partnership feature was particularly calculated, pairing vulnerable members with supposed peers who were actually employees, trained to extract specific types of information through empathetic conversation. Sarah, my accountability partner, wasn't a real member who'd recovered from divorce. She was someone employed to build trust with me and systematically gather details about my life that could be valuable to potential buyers. The detective walked me through evidence they'd gathered about Sarah specifically. Her real name was something else entirely, and she'd been matched with around 40 different women across various support groups, always playing the role of recovered peer offering help to newer members. She had scripts for different scenarios, guidelines for what information to prioritize, training in how to build trust and encourage vulnerable disclosure. Learning that those months of what felt like genuine friendship had been calculated, manipulation was devastating in a way that's difficult to articulate. Sarah's empathy had been performance, her understanding had been strategic, and every vulnerable thing I'd shared with her had been recorded and packaged for sale to strangers who viewed my emotional struggles as exploitable weaknesses. The police investigation eventually led to arrests of several people involved in operating the support groups and marketplace. But the profiles themselves had already been widely distributed. My information, along with hundreds of other women's detailed personal disclosures, existed in private collections of people who downloaded them before law enforcement shut down the marketplace. I had to make significant changes to my life to feel even marginally safe after discovering this. I moved to a different area within Plymouth, stopped using my previous routines, closed down most of my social media presence. I'm hypervigilant about what information I share online now, even in contexts that seem genuinely helpful and supportive. The experience has made me deeply suspicious of online communities and reluctant to seek help even when I need it. What haunts me most is thinking about the 8 unknown buyers who purchased my profile. Who were they? Why were they interested in detailed information about me specifically? What did they plan to do with knowledge of my fears and routines? The journalist and police identified connections to some crimes, but most buyers remained untraced, their intentions unknown, their continued interest in my information impossible to assess. I also think about the other women whose profiles were sold through that marketplace. How many of them still don't know what happened, still believe they participated in genuine support groups, still trust that their vulnerable disclosures were held in confidence by compassionate peers? The journalist contacted everyone she could identify, but there were gaps in member information, and many women who'd used pseudonyms that couldn't be traced to real identities. The psychological impact has been harder to manage than the practical security measures. I struggle to trust people now, particularly when they seem understanding or supportive. I question whether kindness is genuine or calculated, whether people asking about my well-being actually care, or are gathering information for purposes I don't understand. The suspicion affects my relationships and makes it difficult to accept help even from people who genuinely want to provide it. I joined that support group looking for help during a difficult time in my life. I shared my fears, my struggles, my vulnerable moments, believing I was participating in a community of mutual support and understanding. Instead, I was providing detailed intelligence that was compiled, analyzed, and sold to people who viewed my emotional vulnerability as exploitable weakness. That's what I think about now when I see online support groups advertised. Not whether they're genuinely helpful or moderated by caring people, but whether they're information gathering operations targeting vulnerable individuals. Whether the supportive responses and empathetic questions are genuine or strategic, designed to extract valuable personal details that can be packaged and sold to buyers with malicious intent. The profiles exist. The violation is permanent, and somewhere 8 different people or organizations possess comprehensive information about my life during my most vulnerable period, information I shared voluntarily believing I was seeking help from people who understood my struggles. That knowledge has changed how I navigate the world, making me cautious where I used to be trusting, suspicious where I used to be open, isolated where I used to seek connection. I sought help when I was struggling, and that decision to reach out left me permanently compromised. My vulnerability was weaponized, my trust was exploited, and my most private struggles were converted into a product sold to strangers whose interest in me is anything but compassionate. That's the price I paid for trying to find support during a difficult time, and it's a price I'll be paying for the rest of my life. I won something once, or at least I thought I had. It was one of those online competitions you enter without really expecting anything to come of it, the sort where you provide your email address and answer a few questions for a chance at winning a holiday or a voucher. I can't even remember now which competition it was specifically, just that I'd entered several around the same time, and one of them had apparently selected me as a winner. That moment of unexpected good luck is the reason I now sleep with my curtains drawn, my phone on silent, and a growing sense that I'm being watched in ways I'll never fully understand. I'm a hairdresser working at a salon in Leicester. Been there for around 8 years now. It's a good job, steady clientele. The kind of work where you get to know people over time through their regular appointments. I rent a small flat above a chip shop on a busy road near the city centre. Nothing fancy, but it's affordable and convenient for getting to work. I live alone. Always have preferred it that way, though that independence feels more like vulnerability now. The email about winning the competition arrived on a Saturday morning last spring. I'd been entering various online competitions for months, mostly out of boredom during quiet evenings at home. Gift vouchers, spa days, weekend breaks, the kind of prizes that seemed appealing but unlikely. The email said I'd won a luxury hamper worth around £300, filled with premium foods and wines, and I just needed to confirm my delivery details. The message looked legitimate enough. Professional formatting, a logo I vaguely recognized from one of the competition websites I'd visited, congratulatory language that seemed genuine. It asked me to click a link to verify my details and select a delivery date. I did exactly that, pleased with my unexpected luck and already mentally planning who I'd share the hamper contents with. The verification form asked for standard delivery information. My full name and address, obviously, but also a phone number in case the courier needed to contact me. Then it asked about my availability for delivery, wanting to know which days I typically worked, what hours I was usually home, whether I had neighbors who could accept packages on my behalf. It explained that the hamper contained perishable items and needed to be delivered when someone would definitely be available to receive it. I provided all the information requested. My work schedule at the salon, the fact that I worked Tuesday through Saturday, that I was usually home by 7 in the evening on work days and all day Sunday and Monday. I mentioned I didn't really know my neighbors well enough to have them accept deliveries, and that the best time would be Sunday afternoon when I was definitely home. The form also asked about dietary restrictions and preferences, supposedly so they could tailor the hamper contents appropriately. I answered those questions too, noting that I was vegetarian, that I didn't drink red wine, that I had a mild allergy to nuts. It seemed like good customer service, making sure the prize would actually be something I could enjoy, rather than a generic selection. A confirmation email arrived within minutes, thanking me for providing my details and saying the hamper would be delivered within 2 weeks. I felt satisfied and lucky, the small rush of pleasure that comes from winning something unexpected, even if it wasn't life-changing. The hamper never arrived. After 3 weeks, I tried to follow up using the email address from the original message, but my emails bounced back as undeliverable. I searched for the competition website I thought I'd entered, but I couldn't find it anymore. I checked my browser history, but I'd entered so many different competitions that I couldn't identify which specific one had supposedly selected me as a winner. I eventually accepted that it had probably been a scam, annoyed with myself for falling for it, but assuming the worst consequence would be some spam emails. I hadn't provided bank details or anything that could be used for direct financial fraud, just delivery information and personal preferences. It seemed like an elaborate scam for relatively minimal payoff. but I figured the scammers had probably sent the same email to thousands of people hoping to collect data they could sell to marketing companies. About a month later, I started noticing a car parked on my street that I didn't recognize. A dark blue Vauxhall, usually parked a few spaces down from my building, often there when I left for work and still there when I returned. I didn't think much of it initially. Parking on my street was always competitive, and residents often left cars in the same spots for days at a time. Then I started seeing the same car in other locations, parked near the salon where I worked, visible from the window where I spent most of my day cutting hair, parked outside the supermarket I usually shopped at on Sunday mornings, parked near the bus stop I used when visiting my mum across town. The same dark blue Vauxhall, or at least what appeared to be the same one, showing up in too many places to be coincidental. I tried to get a look at the driver, but the windows were tinted enough that I could only make out vague shapes inside. I never saw anyone get in or out of the car, never caught a clear view of who was driving. It was just there, persistently present in locations where I spent time, watching without ever doing anything overtly threatening. I reported it to the police, explaining that I believed someone was following me. They took a statement and said they'd increase patrols in my area, but they were honest about how difficult it was to act on these situations. Following someone wasn't itself illegal unless it crossed into harassment or stalking territory, and I didn't have evidence of threats or direct contact. They took down the registration number I'd managed to note, but when they checked it, the car was registered to a leasing company with multiple vehicles on their fleet. Tracing who was actually driving at any given time would be nearly impossible. The car eventually stopped appearing, or at least I stopped noticing it after a few weeks. I told myself I'd been paranoid, that it was probably someone who happened to live and work in similar areas to me, that the pattern I'd seen was just coincidence amplified by anxiety. Then other things started happening, small things at first, easy to dismiss individually, but forming a pattern that became harder to ignore. I'd find my rubbish bin moved from where I'd left it, positioned differently than I remembered. The position of my doormat would be slightly off, as though someone had lifted it and replaced it carelessly. Once I found a cigarette stub near my door, even though I didn't smoke and neither did any of my neighbors as far as I knew. Inside my flat, I'd noticed minor changes that could have been my own forgetfulness, but felt wrong. A kitchen cupboard left slightly ajar when I was certain I'd closed it. A book moved on my shelf, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed it wasn't where I'd last placed it. My bathroom window left unlatched when I always kept it locked. I started documenting these incidents, taking photos of how I left things so I could compare them when I returned. The documentation confirmed I wasn't imagining it. Things were being moved, adjusted, interfered with while I was out. Someone had access to my flat, entering and leaving without forcing locks or breaking windows, just subtle enough that each individual incident could be explained away as forgetfulness or accident. I had my locks changed, installed a chain on the door, checked all the windows obsessively before leaving. The disturbances continued. A drawer in my bedroom would be open slightly. A coat in my wardrobe would be hanging differently than I'd left it. My toothbrush would be in a different position on the sink. What made it more disturbing was that nothing was ever stolen or damaged. Whoever was entering my flat wasn't taking anything or leaving obvious evidence of their presence. They were just moving through my space, touching my belongings, making their presence known in the smallest possible ways. It felt like psychological warfare, designed to make me question my own perception and feel unsafe in my own home. I installed a small camera in my living room. One of those basic security cameras that connects to your phone and records when it detects movement. The first few days showed nothing unusual. Just me moving around the flat going about my normal routine. Then on the fourth day, whilst I was at work, the camera captured someone entering my flat. The figure was dressed in dark clothes and wore a balaclava that completely obscured their face. They moved through my flat systematically, not looking for valuables to steal, but appearing to document everything. They opened drawers and cupboards, looked through papers on my desk, examined items on my shelves. They spent several minutes in my bedroom, going through my wardrobe and checking under my bed. The whole intrusion lasted about 40 minutes before they left as silently as they'd entered. Most disturbing was what they did at the end. They walked directly to where the camera was positioned, despite it being small and relatively well hidden. They stood there for several long seconds, staring directly into the lens, letting me know they were aware of being recorded and weren't concerned about it. Then they reached up and adjusted the camera angle slightly before leaving. A small violation that made it clear they could access my flat whenever they wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I took the footage to the police immediately. They treated it more seriously this time, with actual evidence of someone illegally entering my home. But the figure in the video was completely unidentifiable, and they'd been careful not to touch anything that might leave fingerprints. The police arranged for forensics to check my flat, but they found nothing useful. Whoever was entering knew how to avoid leaving evidence. A detective assigned to my case asked if I'd recently signed up for any online services or provided personal information to anyone I didn't know well. I mentioned the competition email from months earlier, though I didn't see how that could be connected. She asked if I still had the email, and when I showed it to her, her expression changed. She explained that these fake competition emails were being used to gather detailed information about people's routines and living situations. The questions about work schedules, availability times, living alone, dietary preferences, none of it was about delivering a hamper. It was intelligence gathering, creating profiles of potential targets who could be monitored and accessed. The detective showed me how to access a dark web marketplace where these profiles were being sold. My information was listed there, complete with everything I'd provided on that verification form, and additional details that had apparently been gathered through surveillance. My work schedule, the fact that I lived alone, my regular shopping times, even my recent habit of visiting my mum on Sunday afternoons, all documented, analyzed and made available for purchase. The listing described me as an ideal target for what they called residential access services. People could purchase rights to enter my flat during specific time windows when I was reliably away. The profile explained that locks had been bypassed using specialized tools, that the flat had minimal security, that entry and exit could be accomplished without alerting neighbors or authorities. But it wasn't just about burglary. The listing mentioned that the flat had been accessed multiple times already for photography and documentation purposes. There were buyers interested in detailed images of someone's private living space, in being able to study how a person organized their belongings, in having visual access to intimate details of a stranger's life. The marketplace showed my profile had been purchased multiple times by different users. Some had bought access for physical entry, which explained the person caught on my camera. Others had purchased photographic documentation, which meant images of my private space existed somewhere I'd never find them. The listing was still active, still accepting new purchases, still describing my flat as available for access. Comments beneath my listing discussed the quality of access and the accuracy of the timing information. Previous buyers had left feedback rating their experience, mentioning that my routine was reliable and that entry was straightforward. One comment noted that I'd installed a camera which had been easily managed during their visit. Another comment discussed specific items in my bedroom, describing my belongings in detail that suggested they'd spent considerable time examining my personal space. The police investigation eventually identified the person who'd created my profile, someone who'd sent thousands of fake competition emails and collected information from hundreds of respondents. They were prosecuted for fraud and other offenses, but the marketplace itself continued operating, and the profiles that had already been created remained accessible. My information was still there, marked as potentially compromised, but still available for reference. I moved out of that flat within weeks of discovering the marketplace. I couldn't stay somewhere that had been so thoroughly violated, that multiple strangers had accessed and photographed while I was away. My new place has serious security, proper locks, multiple cameras, alarm system, the works. I'm hyper-vigilant about any requests for personal information, no matter how innocent they seem. But I know the profile still exists somewhere online. My old address, my routine from that period, images of my former living space that strangers can still view and study. The listing has been updated to note that I've moved, but the historical information remains accessible, permanently archived in spaces I can't reach or control. What haunts me most is thinking about all the other people who received similar competition emails and filled out verification forms, never realizing what they were actually providing. The detective told me thousands of these profiles had been created across the UK, targeting people who lived alone, who had predictable routines, who seemed vulnerable in ways that made their living spaces attractive to buyers on these dark web marketplaces. I still see marketing emails sometimes about competitions and prize draws, and I wonder how many are legitimate and how many are intelligence-gathering operations. Every request for personal information makes me suspicious now. Every form that asks about my schedule or living situation raises red flags that most people would never notice. The person caught on my camera was never identified. The police believe they were hired specifically to enter my flat and document it. Probably someone who'd purchased access through that marketplace and decided to verify the information they'd bought. They might have been planning something more serious, or they might have just been satisfied with the intrusion itself, the violation of entering someone's private space without their knowledge. I'll never know how many times my flat was accessed before I installed the camera. How many strangers walked through my rooms, examined my belongings, photographed my space while I was at work or visiting my mum. The camera only caught one person, but the marketplace comments suggested there had been multiple successful entries by different buyers over several months. That's what I think about now when I'm alone in my new flat, despite all the security measures I've installed. The knowledge that somewhere online, detailed information about my life is still available for purchase. That images of my former bedroom, my wardrobe, my personal belongings exist in private collections I'll never locate. That I enabled all of it by entering a competition I can't even remember, by filling out a verification form that seemed completely harmless. I won something once, or thought I had. What I actually won was a permanent place in a dark web marketplace, a profile describing my vulnerabilities and routines, and the knowledge that my privacy was systematically violated by people I'll never identify. All from answering a few questions about a hamper I was never going to receive. The competition was fake, but the consequences were real. That's what keeps me careful now, questioning everything, trusting nothing that seems too good to be true, because I learned the hard way that sometimes the cost of free entry is everything you thought was private, documented, and sold to strangers who view your life as a commodity worth purchasing. Have you ever wondered what happens to the parts of yourself you lose in war? Not the obvious bits, the limbs, the hearing, the scars you can see in the mirror. I'm talking about the invisible pieces, the ability to sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times, the capacity to sit in a restaurant without your back to the wall, the simple faith that most people are fundamentally decent. Those are the parts that don't grow back, no matter how many therapy sessions the doctors threw at you. I came back from Afghanistan in late 2018, medically discharged after an IED took out half my patrol and left me with a collection of metal fragments in my left leg and a head full of memories I couldn't switch off. The physical therapy was straightforward enough. Learn to walk properly again, build up the strength, adapt to the new limitations. The mental side was trickier. The flat they set me up with in Aldershot was decent enough. Ground floor, which suited the leg, and quiet neighbours who minded their own business. The occupational therapist had been very pleased with herself when she'd arranged it. Close to the base for support, she'd said, but far enough away to feel civilian. What she hadn't mentioned was how the silence would press against your ears at night, or how every settling beam and creaking pipe would send your heart racing. Sleep became something that happened to other people. I'd lie there listening to the world outside my window. The occasional car, a fox in the bins, the milk float doing its rounds at 4:30. Sometimes I'd doze off around dawn, only to wake up an hour later feeling worse than when I'd gone to bed. That's how I discovered the internet had a whole world that came alive when the rest of Britain was asleep. Forums for insomniacs, chat rooms for shift workers, communities of people who existed in the margins of normal daylight hours. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just human contact that didn't require explaining why I was awake at 3 in the morning or why crowds made me nervous. The transition from regular internet to the darker corners happened gradually. Someone in an insomnia forum mentioned privacy tools, ways to browse without leaving digital footprints. Given my background, the concept of operational security appealed to me. Old habits, I suppose. In the army, you learn to cover your tracks, to move without being seen, to gather intelligence without revealing your position. Installing Tor felt like putting on body armor, that same sense of protection, of creating barriers between yourself and potential threats. The dark web wasn't what I'd expected. Less criminal marketplace, more like a parallel internet where people could speak freely about things that wouldn't be tolerated on Facebook or Twitter. Political dissidents, whistleblowers, people living under authoritarian regimes. It felt purposeful, almost noble. The first few weeks I just observed. Reading forums about government surveillance, privacy rights, digital freedom. There was something therapeutic about it. Being part of a community that understood the value of staying hidden, of operating below the radar. These people got it in a way that civilian therapists never could. It was in one of these privacy forums that I first heard about red rooms, not from someone promoting them, but from a discussion about online myths and digital urban legends. Someone had posted a long thread debunking various dark web horror stories, explaining how most of the sensational stuff you read in newspapers was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Red rooms, according to this poster, were particularly ridiculous. The technical challenges alone made them impractical. Streaming live video over Tor was unreliable, the latency was terrible, and the bandwidth requirements were enormous. More importantly, they argued, the risk to reward ratio made no sense. Why would criminals expose themselves to that level of surveillance and law enforcement attention when there were easier ways to make money? The post was thorough, well-researched, and completely convincing. It also had the unintended effect of making me curious about whether they actually existed. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity. After years of intelligence work, you develop a natural skepticism about official narratives. When someone tells you something is impossible, your first instinct is to test that assertion. Not because you want to find something horrific, but because you want to understand how the world actually works, rather than how people say it works. The search took weeks. Most of the links I found led to obvious scams, sites demanding payment upfront or requiring personal information that any sensible person would never provide. Others were clearly honey traps, probably run by law enforcement agencies trying to catch people with questionable intentions. But occasionally, buried deep in technical discussions or hidden in the metadata of seemingly unrelated files, I'd find references that seemed more genuine. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd been helping out at a veteran support group, not talking, just making tea and setting up chairs, when I overheard a conversation between two ex-Signals operators about online payment systems. They were discussing the profit margins on different digital services, and one of them mentioned that the real money wasn't in legitimate businesses, but in providing services that people couldn't get through normal channels. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask, but something about the way he'd said it stuck with me. The next time I was browsing the dark web, I started looking at it differently. Instead of searching for red rooms directly, I started following the money, payment processors, digital transfer systems, the financial infrastructure that would be needed to support something like live streaming to paying customers. That's how I found the marketplace. It was hidden several layers deep, accessible only through a series of referral links that changed daily. The front page looked like any other dark web market. Drugs, fake documents, stolen credit card details. But there was a section marked Premium Services that required additional verification to access. The verification process was more thorough than anything I'd encountered. Not just prepayment through untraceable methods, but proof of identity that had to be cross-referenced against previous purchases, references from existing members, even a brief interview conducted through encrypted chat to confirm you weren't law enforcement. It took nearly a month to get approved, and by the time I did, I wasn't sure I actually wanted access anymore. But the same compulsion that had carried me through 3 tours in Afghanistan, the need to see a mission through to completion, kept me going. The Premium Services section was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 30 or 40 listings, mostly for things that were disturbing, but not particularly surprising. Custom pornography, identity theft services, professional harassment campaigns, the sort of services that existed in the grey areas between legal and illegal, catering to people with money and flexible morals. The listings that interested me were at the bottom of the page, in a subcategory marked Live Entertainment. 3 different providers, each offering real-time streaming services with interactive elements. The descriptions were deliberately vague. Authentic experiences, unscripted content, viewer participation opportunities. But the prices gave them away. These weren't webcam shows or adult entertainment. They were charging thousands of pounds for single sessions. I spent another week researching the providers before making contact with one. Their listing claimed to offer documentary-style content featuring real participants in authentic scenarios. The language was careful, designed to provide plausible deniability while making the actual service clear to interested buyers. The booking process was surprisingly professional. encrypted email exchanges, detailed technical requirements for viewing, even a customer service representative who walked me through the setup process. They operated like a legitimate business, complete with scheduling systems and technical support. The session was arranged for a Tuesday night at 11:30. I was provided with a unique link and access credentials that would only work during a specific 2-hour window. The technical requirements were extensive: updated browsers, specific security plugins, a reliable internet connection with minimum bandwidth requirements. When the time came, I almost didn't connect. I sat at my laptop for nearly 20 minutes, cursor hovering over the link, trying to decide if I really wanted to see what I was about to see. In the end, it was the same morbid curiosity that had carried me this far. I needed to know if it was real. The stream loaded slowly, buffering every few seconds as the encrypted video fought its way through Tor's layered network. When it finally stabilized, I was looking at what appeared to be a basement or cellar. Concrete walls, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a chair positioned in the center of the frame. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room with occasionally flickering lighting. As the video quality adjusted, I was beginning to think I'd been scammed when a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It was a man in his 40s or 50s, wearing coveralls and latex gloves. He moved methodically around the room, checking equipment I couldn't quite see, adjusting the camera angle, preparing for something. His movements were practiced, professional. This wasn't his first time doing whatever he was about to do. A chat window had appeared beside the video player, showing messages from other viewers. There weren't many, maybe 8 or 10 people total, but they were clearly regulars. They talked about previous sessions, compared notes on different providers, discussed technical aspects of the streaming quality like they were reviewing a television program. Then someone else entered the room. She was young, probably early 20s, and clearly confused about where she was or how she'd gotten there. The man in coveralls guided her to the chair with gentle but firm insistence, speaking to her in what appeared to be a calming manner. She kept looking around the room, taking in the concrete walls and bare bulb and camera equipment with growing alarm. The chat exploded with activity. Viewers were making requests, placing bets, discussing what they wanted to see happen next. Payment details were being shared. Transactions were being arranged in real time. I watched in horrified fascination as what I was witnessing transformed from documentary into auction. I should have closed the browser, should have reported what I was seeing to the police, though I had no idea how to explain how I'd found it, or whether they'd even believe me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by the same terrible fascination that had carried me through firefights in Helmand, that state of hyper-awareness where time slows down and you observe everything with crystalline clarity while being unable to act. The man in coveralls began responding to specific requests from the chat. He would pause, read something on a screen I couldn't see, then nod or shake his head. Sometimes he would hold up different tools for the camera, letting the viewers choose which one he should use. It was interactive in the most disturbing way possible. A live-streamed crime where the audience was complicit in every decision. Then something changed. The chat messages stopped, replaced by a single repeated warning from multiple users. Terminate session, terminate session, terminate session. The man in coveralls looked directly at the camera, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm. He moved quickly to something off screen, and seconds later the video cut out entirely. I stared at a blank screen, showing only a connection error message. When I tried to reload the page, The link was dead. The entire marketplace had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed had been staged. Elaborate theatre designed to part fools from their money. The production quality had been too professional, the interactive elements too seamless. Real criminals wouldn't operate with such sophisticated customer service and technical infrastructure. But I kept thinking about those final moments before the feed cut out. The way the man's expression had changed when he'd seen those warning messages. The speed with which everything had shut down. It felt less like a performance ending and more like an emergency evacuation. 3 weeks later, I received a package. It arrived by regular post, addressed to my flat with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on ordinary paper with a home printer. It showed the interior of my living room, taken from the position of my laptop screen. I was visible in the background, sitting at my kitchen table, clearly recognizable despite the low light. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single line in neat handwriting. "We know what you watched." I called the police immediately, reported the break-in, showed them the photograph, explained about the package. But what could they do? No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no way to trace where the photograph had come from. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly thought I was either paranoid or making it up. I've changed the logs 3 times since then, installed security cameras, motion sensors, even hired a private investigator to check if anyone had been asking questions about me. Nothing. Whoever had been in my flat had left no trace beyond that single photograph. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, I wonder if they ever really left. Because the thing about surveillance is that once you know you're being watched, you never stop feeling those eyes on you. I still get packages occasionally, never more than once a month, always delivered by regular post. Sometimes it's another photograph, my kitchen, my bedroom, the view from my living room window. Once it was a printout of my medical records from the army. Last month it was a copy of my therapy notes from the NHS. Each one carries the same message on the back. We know what you watched. I don't know if it's a threat or just a reminder. I don't know if they want something from me, or if they're simply ensuring I remember what I witnessed. But I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The worst part isn't the invasion of privacy, or even the constant feeling of being monitored. It's knowing that somewhere out there, that basement with the concrete walls and single bare bulb might still be operating. That other people might be sitting at their computers right now, watching live streams of things that should never happen, placing bets on human suffering like it's a sporting event. And I'm the only one who knows it's real. At least, I hope I'm the only one. What would you do if you woke up one day and found photographs of yourself asleep? What if they were uploaded to a website you've never heard of and taken inside your own bedroom by someone you've never seen? That happened to me, and I wish I noticed something was wrong sooner than I did. I should explain that I'm not the sort of person who worries excessively about security. I live in a quiet residential street in Reading, the kind of area where people still leave their bins out overnight without them being knocked over, and where the biggest crime is usually teenagers writing on garden walls. My house is a small terraced place, built sometime in the 30s, with the original locks on most of the doors, because I'd never seen any reason to change them. The whole thing started when my neighbor Jenny mentioned she'd seen someone in my back garden around 3 in the morning. She'd been up with her newborn and happened to glance out the window whilst feeding him. She saw a figure moving along the side passage between our houses, staying close to my wall. At the time, she assumed it was me taking the bins out or checking on something, and thought nothing more of it until she mentioned it in passing a week later. I told her it definitely hadn't been me. I'm not someone who wanders around the garden in the middle of the night, and I'd been asleep at that hour. We both tried to rationalize it as maybe a cat or a trick of the shadows, but Jenny seemed certain she'd seen a person. She described them as average height, wearing dark clothing, moving deliberately rather than stumbling around like someone drunk or lost. That conversation sat uncomfortably with me for the next few days. I found myself checking the locks more carefully before bed and looking out the back window more often than usual. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place though. The gate was still closed, the bins were where I'd left them, and there were no signs of anyone having been in the garden at all. Then I started noticing small things that seemed off. A kitchen chair pulled slightly away from the table when I was certain I'd pushed it in the night before. The bathroom door left ajar when I always closed it fully. The living room curtain not quite meeting in the middle the way I usually arranged it. None of these things were significant on their own, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid after Jenny's comment had put the idea in my head. What made me take it seriously was the smell. I came downstairs one morning and noticed a faint scent in the hallway that hadn't been there before. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Something like fabric softener or a particular type of soap that I didn't use. It was subtle enough that I almost dismissed it, but it lingered just long enough to make me uncomfortable. I started to wonder if someone really had been in my house, though I couldn't work out how or why. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside each morning. Nothing was missing or damaged. There was no rational explanation for how someone could have entered without leaving any trace or taking anything valuable. My friend Claire, who's a paralegal, suggested I set up a camera. Not an elaborate security system, just one of those basic indoor cameras that connects to your phone and records when it detects movement. She'd used one to monitor her cat while she was at work and said they were cheap and simple to install. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of filming my own house, but the alternative of continuing to wonder if someone was breaking in seemed worse. I bought a small camera and positioned it in the hallway, angled so it would capture anyone coming down the stairs or entering through the front door. The setup was straightforward enough that even I could manage it, just connecting it to my wireless internet and downloading an app to my phone. The camera would save recordings to a cloud service automatically, keeping them for a week before deleting them to make space for new footage. For the first 3 nights, nothing appeared on the recordings except me moving around the house in the evening before bed and then leaving for work in the morning. I started to feel foolish for even setting it up, convinced I'd been overreacting to Jenny's offhand comment and a few coincidences that meant nothing. On the 4th night, the camera recorded someone entering my house at 2:30 in the morning. I discovered the footage the following afternoon at work, checking the app during my lunch break more out of habit than any real expectation of seeing anything unusual. The recording showed my hallway in the greenish night vision mode, perfectly still and empty. Then, at 2:31, the front door opened smoothly and silently. A figure stepped inside, closed the door behind them with careful precision, and stood motionless in my hallway for nearly a minute. They were wearing dark clothes and what looked like a balaclava or ski mask covering their face. Average build, impossible to determine age or any identifying features from the footage. They carried a small bag over one shoulder and something in their right hand that I couldn't make out clearly in the grainy night vision recording. After that initial pause, they moved through the hallway and out of the camera's view, heading toward the kitchen. The recording continued, showing the empty hallway for another 47 minutes, and then the figure reappeared, walking calmly back toward the front door. They paused again before leaving, this time turning to look directly at where the camera was positioned. Even through the mask, I could sense them staring at it for several long seconds before they opened the door and left. I watched that recording probably 20 times sitting at my desk, trying to understand what I was seeing. Someone had been inside my house while I slept upstairs, moving through my rooms for nearly an hour, and then left without taking anything or making any noise that woke me. The casualness of their movements suggested this wasn't their first time doing this. They knew the layout, knew how to open the old front door without making it creak, knew exactly how much time they had. I should have gone straight to the police, but I was too shaken to think clearly. I left work early, claiming I felt ill, and drove home in a daze. When I got there, I went through every room trying to see if anything was missing or disturbed. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. Nothing taken, nothing moved, nothing that would explain why someone had spent almost an hour in my house in the middle of the night. That evening, I changed all the locks. It cost more than I could comfortably afford to get someone out on short notice, but I needed to know the house was secure before I could even think about sleeping there again. The locksmith who came was professional and efficient, replacing both the front and back door locks with modern deadbolts that couldn't be picked easily. He commented that the old locks had been pretty useless anyway, the kind that anyone with basic knowledge could open in under a minute. I positioned the camera in the living room that night, wanting to see if they tried to return now that the locks had changed. I barely slept, lying awake listening for any sound of someone trying to get in. Every creak of the house settling made my heart race. Around 4 a.m, I finally drifted off from sheer exhaustion. When I checked the footage the next day, there was nothing. No attempt to enter, no figure in the garden, nothing at all. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Perhaps changing the locks had been enough to deter them. Perhaps they'd realized I was aware of their presence and had moved on to easier targets. I tried to return to normal life, though I was now hyper-aware of every sound in the house and couldn't shake the feeling of violation that came with knowing a stranger had been moving through my rooms while I slept. I reported the footage to the police, who took a statement and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but were honest about the low likelihood of catching whoever it was without more evidence or a similar incident nearby. About a week later, I received a message through social media from an account I didn't recognize. The profile had no photos and had been created recently, with no friends or other activity. The message was simple and direct. It contained a link to a website and nothing else. No explanation, no text, just a URL that meant nothing to me. I knew I shouldn't click on links from unknown sources, but something about the timing made me curious. I copied the link and searched for it online, trying to see if it was a known phishing site or malware distribution point. Nothing came up in normal search results. The link appeared to be to a website on the dark web, one of those addresses made up of random letters and numbers that couldn't be accessed through regular browsers. I spent the rest of that evening reading about how to access these hidden websites, though I was increasingly certain I didn't want to know what was at that particular address. But the not knowing was almost worse than any concrete information could be. I kept thinking about that figure standing in my hallway, staring at the camera, and wondering if this link was connected to those intrusions. Eventually, I set up the necessary software and entered the address, half expecting it to be some kind of virus or trap. What loaded instead was a simple website with minimal design, just a dark background and a grid of thumbnail images. It took me a moment to recognize what I was looking at. They were photographs of the inside of my house, dozens of them, taken from various angles and at different times, all uploaded to this website that existed in the hidden corners of the internet, where regular search engines couldn't reach. The images showed my kitchen, my living room, my bedroom. Some were taken during the day when I was at work, showing my possessions in clear daylight. Others were taken at night, capturing my furniture and belongings in the dim glow of streetlights through the windows. Each image was date-stamped, showing they'd been taken over a period of several months, long before I'd even known anyone was entering my house. But what made my blood run cold were the images that showed me, asleep in my bed, unaware I was being photographed, sitting on the sofa watching television, captured through what must have been a gap in the curtains, making breakfast in the kitchen, completely oblivious to whoever was documenting my routine. Below the grid of images was a counter showing how many times the page had been viewed. The number was in the hundreds. Hundreds of people had accessed this website and looked at photographs of the inside of my house and of me going about my private life, completely unaware I was being watched and documented. There was a comment section beneath the images, though I could barely bring myself to read them. People discussing the photographs in detached analytical terms, as though they were reviewing property listings or holiday destinations. Some comments requested specific types of images or particular angles. Others debated technical details about the photography equipment used or the best times to capture certain shots. One comment thread discussed how the photographer had gained access, with several people sharing their own techniques for entering homes without leaving evidence. Another thread speculated about my daily routine based on the timestamps of the images, constructing an alarmingly accurate picture of my life from these stolen moments. I reported the website to the police immediately, though they explained that sites on the dark web were notoriously difficult to take down or trace to their creators. They assigned someone from their cybercrime unit to investigate, but warned me that these cases rarely resulted in arrests unless the perpetrator made a significant mistake or unless they were already under investigation for other crimes. The detective I spoke to explained that this type of activity had become increasingly common, with people breaking into homes specifically to photograph them for sale or entertainment on these hidden websites. Some did it for money, selling access to the images. Others did it for the thrill or for the attention from others interested in this particular violation of privacy. The images themselves, while disturbing and invasive, didn't always constitute clear criminal activity unless they crossed certain lines the law recognized. I had the house swept by a security specialist who found a tiny camera hidden in my smoke detector, one that had been there for months, silently recording and transmitting images whenever it detected movement. The specialist found a second camera behind a picture frame in my bedroom, positioned to capture the sleeping area. Both were sophisticated enough to connect to wireless internet and upload their footage automatically, which explained how the photographer had so many images without needing to physically retrieve memory cards. The specialist explained that these cameras were readily available online, marketed for legitimate security purposes, but commonly used for exactly this kind of intrusion. They were small enough to hide in plain sight and could run for months on battery power. The person who'd installed them had probably done so during one of their early visits to my house, long before I'd had any reason to suspect someone was breaking in. I moved out of that house within a month, I couldn't stay there knowing those images were still circulating on that website and probably copied to dozens of other sites I'd never find. Couldn't sleep in a bedroom that had been photographed and studied by hundreds of strangers. Couldn't live with the knowledge that someone had spent months carefully documenting my private life for reasons I still don't fully understand. The website itself was eventually taken down, though the detective confirmed that the images had almost certainly been downloaded and shared elsewhere before it disappeared. Once something exists on the dark web, removing all traces becomes nearly impossible. Those photographs of my home and my life are out there somewhere, archived and accessible to anyone who knows where to look. What haunts me most is not knowing who did it or why they chose my house specifically. Was it random? Or had they been watching me before they started breaking in? Were they someone I knew, someone I'd passed in the street without recognition? The thought that I might have spoken to them, might have smiled at them while completely unaware of what they'd done, makes my skin crawl. I've taken every precaution I can think of in my new place. Modern locks, proper security system, regular checks for hidden cameras, curtains that actually block the view from outside. But I know that none of these measures can undo what's already been done or guarantee it won't happen again. I know that somewhere online, accessible to anyone with the knowledge to find it, there's a record of my most private moments, shared and discussed by strangers who see my violation as entertainment. Sometimes I wonder if the person who did this is reading this account, recognizing the details even though I've been careful not to identify myself too specifically. I wonder if they moved on to someone else after I moved out, if there's another house somewhere with cameras hidden in smoke detectors and another person going about their life unaware they're being watched. The worst part is knowing how long it went on before I noticed anything wrong. Months of someone entering my house regularly, setting up equipment, taking photographs, treating my home like their own private project. Months of me sleeping peacefully while a stranger stood in my bedroom photographing me. All of that happened in a quiet residential street in Reading, in a house I'd felt completely safe in, to someone who'd never given anyone reason to target them. That's what keeps me awake now, in a different house with better locks and security cameras of my own. Not fear of the person who did it, but the knowledge of how easy it was for them, how little effort it took to turn my home into something else entirely, something I can never get back no matter how many times I move or how many precautions I take. The photographs exist, the violation exists, and somewhere on the hidden internet, it always will. Imagine you're lying awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling of your bedsit in Croydon, listening to the couple upstairs having another screaming match through the paper-thin walls. The divorce papers are still scattered across your kitchen table from where your solicitor dropped them off that afternoon, and the reality of your new life, if you can call it that, is starting to sink in properly. That's how it started for me anyway. 6 months of sleeping rough on my mate's sofa until I could scrape together enough for the deposit on this place. 38 years old and starting over with nothing but a suitcase and a laptop that'd seen better days. The insomnia had been getting worse since the split. Sarah had kept the house, obviously. Her name was on the mortgage. Her parents had helped with the deposit. Fair enough, I suppose. But it didn't make the transition any easier. I tried everything for the sleeplessness. Herbal teas, meditation apps, those expensive blackout curtains that promised to transform your bedroom into a cave. Nothing worked. By 3:30 most nights, I'd given up entirely and found myself hunched over the laptop at my tiny kitchen table. aimlessly scrolling through whatever rubbish the internet had to offer. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I first stumbled across the forums. Not the usual Reddit threads or Facebook groups, deeper than that. Someone on a cryptocurrency discussion board had mentioned something about hidden marketplaces, places where you could find things that weren't available through normal channels. Nothing sinister, mind you, just hard-to-find electronics, rare books, that sort of thing. The conversation had piqued my curiosity. I'd heard about the dark web before, of course. Everyone has. Usually in the context of drug dealers and identity theft, the sort of thing that makes for sensational newspaper headlines. But there was something almost academic about the way these forum users discussed it. They talked about privacy, about digital freedom, about accessing information that governments and corporations would prefer you didn't see. It seemed less criminal, more philosophical. I told myself I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The browser installed easily enough, though it took ages to connect through all those layers. When it finally loaded, I found myself staring at a search engine that looked like something from the early days of the internet. Basic, functional, utterly unremarkable. For the first few nights, I just browsed randomly. There were forums dedicated to every conceivable topic, marketplaces selling everything from vintage records to questionable pharmaceutical products, and endless political discussions that made the comments section of any mainstream news site look positively civilized. Most of it was surprisingly mundane, actually. Not the digital den of iniquity I'd been expecting. The red rooms were mentioned in passing during a conversation about live streaming technology. Someone had posted a technical question about bandwidth requirements for real-time video, and another user had made a joke about not needing that much speed unless you were running a red room. Several people had laughed, or at least posted laughing emojis, but I didn't get the reference. A bit of searching revealed that red rooms were supposedly live streams where viewers could watch and direct real-time violence. Urban legend stuff, mostly. Digital folklore. Every explanation I found came with disclaimers about how they probably didn't really exist. How the stories were just myths designed to make the dark web seem more sinister than it actually was. The consensus seemed to be that the technical requirements alone made them impractical. Real-time video streaming over Tor was unreliable at best, and the whole premise seemed more like something from a horror film than actual criminal enterprise. Still, the idea lingered. During those long, sleepless nights, I found myself thinking about it more than I probably should have. Not because I wanted to find one, you understand. The whole concept was revolting. But there was something compulsive about the mystery of it, like picking at a scab or probing a sore tooth with your tongue. It was probably around my third week of regular dark web browsing when I first saw the link. Hidden in a forum discussion about online privacy, posted by a user with a string of random characters for a name. No description, no context, just an address that was significantly longer than the usual ones I'd encountered. Something about it looked different, more complex, more deliberately obscured. I stared at that link for the better part of an hour. Common sense told me to close the browser, make some tea, maybe try to get some sleep. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when you're sitting alone in a grotty bedsit at 4 a.m. with nothing but your own thoughts for company. The page took nearly 10 minutes to load. When it finally appeared, it was almost disappointingly simple. Just a black background with a single video player embedded in the center. No text, no navigation, nothing to indicate what I was looking at. The video player showed a loading symbol, slowly spinning against the darkness. Then it started. The feed was grainy, clearly shot with a cheap webcam in poor lighting. It showed what appeared to be a small windowless room with concrete walls. There was a single chair in the center, currently empty, and a table pushed against one wall. The image quality was terrible, pixelated and stuttering, with frequent dropouts that left the screen frozen for several seconds at a time. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room, occasionally flickering as the video stream struggled to maintain connection. I was beginning to think it was just some sort of technical test when I noticed the chat window that had appeared beside the video player. The messages were scrolling past too quickly to read properly, but I caught fragments. Usernames that were just random strings of letters and numbers, posting short, cryptic comments. Some seemed to be discussing the technical quality of the stream. Others were asking when something was going to start. A few were considerably more explicit about what they hoped to see. I should have closed the browser then, should have deleted Tor, wiped my browsing history, and pretended I'd never seen any of it. Instead, I found myself refreshing the page, trying to get a clearer picture as the video quality fluctuated wildly. Around 4:30, someone entered the room. It was a man, though the poor image quality made it difficult to make out details. Middle-aged, wearing what looked like overalls or a boiler suit. He moved with purpose, arranging items on the table that I couldn't quite make out through the pixelated mess of the video feed. The chat window exploded with activity, dozens of messages appearing and disappearing faster than I could follow. The man in the overalls seemed to be responding to the chat, though I couldn't hear any audio. He would pause, look directly at the camera, then nod or shake his head. Sometimes he would hold up fingers, 1, 2, 3, as if counting or responding to numerical questions from the viewers. Then he left the room again, and we were back to the empty chair and concrete walls. The waiting was almost worse than whatever was coming next. The chat had settled into a steady rhythm of anticipation and crude speculation. I found myself checking the time obsessively. 4:30 became 4:45, then 5 o'clock, then 10 past. Part of me hoped nothing else would happen, that this was all some elaborate hoax or art project. But another part, a part I didn't particularly want to acknowledge, was curious about what came next. When the door opened again, he wasn't alone. The second figure was smaller, harder to make out in the poor lighting. They moved differently, hesitant, unsteady. As they got closer to the camera, I could see it was a woman, though the video quality made it impossible to determine much else about her appearance. She seemed confused, disoriented. The man in overalls guided her to the chair with what appeared to be gentle insistence. The chat went absolutely mental. Messages were appearing so fast they were just a blur of text. I caught glimpses of betting odds, requests for specific actions, discussions of payment methods. Bitcoin addresses were being posted and immediately deleted. The whole thing had the atmosphere of a twisted auction, with viewers bidding on what they wanted to see happen next. I should have stopped watching, should have closed the laptop and walked away. But something kept me glued to the screen. Not excitement, not anticipation, but a kind of horrified fascination, like watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. The man in overalls had returned to his table and was selecting tools with the care of a surgeon. The woman in the chair seemed to be talking, though without audio, I could only see her mouth moving. She looked around the room with growing agitation, testing the restraints that I was only now noticing, held her to the chair. Then something changed in the chat. The frenzied betting and crude requests suddenly stopped, replaced by a series of identical messages from different users. Feed compromised, feed compromised, feed compromised. the video cut out entirely. For a moment, I stared at a blank screen showing only a connection error message. Then the browser crashed completely, taking me back to my desktop. When I tried to reload the Tor browser, it wouldn't connect at all, just sat there attempting to establish a connection through the encrypted network without success. I spent the next hour trying to get back online, convinced that my internet connection had failed or that there was some problem with my laptop. But regular websites loaded fine through Chrome. It was only Tor that refused to work, as if something had completely blocked my access to the dark web. By 6 a.m, I'd given up and tried to get some sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grainy video feed. The empty room, the concrete walls, the woman in the chair. I kept thinking about those final moments before the connection died. The way she'd looked around the room, the careful way the man had selected his tools, the frantic energy of the chat as viewers realized something was wrong. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. Tor still wouldn't connect, no matter what I tried. I reinstalled the browser, reset my internet connection, even ran a full virus scan in case I'd picked up some kind of malware. Nothing worked. It was as if my computer had been permanently banned from accessing the dark web entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the email I received 3 days later. It arrived in my regular inbox, not buried in spam or sent through some anonymous service. Just a normal email from what appeared to be a Gmail account with a random string of numbers for an address. The subject line was blank, and the message contained only a single line of text. "We know you were watching." Below that was a screenshot, poor quality, pixelated, but unmistakably from that night. It showed my laptop screen with the red room video playing, but taken from behind and slightly to the side. Someone had been in my bedsit while I was watching, standing just out of my peripheral vision, close enough to photograph my screen over my shoulder. I checked the timestamp on the email. It had been sent at 4:47 a.m., right around the time the video feed had cut out. I called the police, of course, explained about the break-in, showed them the email. But what could they do? No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no physical evidence that anyone had been inside my flat. The email could have been sent from anywhere in the world. The screenshot could have been doctored. Without the original video, which I couldn't access anymore, there was no way to prove what I'd actually been watching. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly skeptical. He suggested I change my locks and maybe install a security camera, but his tone suggested he thought I was either lying or having some sort of breakdown. I couldn't really blame him. If someone had told me the same story 6 months earlier, I probably would have reacted the same way. That was 2 months ago. I've changed the locks twice, installed a chain and a door alarm, even moved my laptop so I can see the entire room while I'm using it. The insomnia has gotten worse, if anything. Most nights, I just sit at the kitchen table, watching the door and listening for footsteps in the hallway outside. Tor still won't work on my laptop. I've tried everything, different browsers, VPN services, even buying a completely new computer. Nothing connects. It's as if I've been permanently blacklisted from accessing that part of the internet entirely. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet and I'm sitting alone with just the glow of the laptop screen, for company, I wonder if that's actually protection rather than punishment. Because if they could get into my flat once without leaving any trace, if they could take that photograph without me noticing, if they could block my internet access with such precision, what else might they be capable of? I never found out what happened to the woman in the chair, never learned whether what I witnessed was real or just an elaborate hoax designed to draw in curious viewers like myself. But I keep thinking about those final messages in the chat, feed compromised, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, someone had been trying to help her, or if they'd simply been warning each other about people like me. The thing that bothers me most isn't the email or the photograph or even the break-in. It's the timing. The feed cut out at exactly the moment when things were about to go too far, as if someone had been monitoring not just the stream but the viewers as well, as if they knew precisely when to pull the plug to leave people like me with just enough glimpse to be haunted, but not enough evidence to cause real trouble. I still get emails sometimes, never more than once a week, always from different addresses, usually just timestamps, 4:43 a.m., 4:51 a.m., 4:38 a.m., but occasionally something more specific. Last week, I received one that simply said, "Still watching." I don't know if they mean they're still watching me, or if they think I'm still watching them. Both possibilities keep me awake at night. I keep thinking I should have just minded my own business. Looking back, it seems so obvious that nothing good could come from what I did. But at the time, it felt like I was just being helpful. You know how it is when someone asks for advice about something you think you might be able to help with. My brother had been complaining about his dissertation for weeks. He was doing sociology at Leeds, something about online communities and how people behave differently when they think they're anonymous. The research was going badly because he couldn't find what he called genuine examples of how people actually interact in these spaces. Everything he was looking at felt too sanitized, too aware of being observed. His supervisor had mentioned that the most interesting social dynamics happen in the darker corners of the internet, places where people feel completely free from normal social constraints. But my brother had no idea how to access those areas safely, and frankly, neither did I. That's when I made what I now realize was a terrible decision. I mentioned his research problem to Sarah, a colleague from work who dealt with online fraud investigations in our compliance department. She'd been with the company for years and seemed to know about all sorts of digital investigation techniques. Sarah listened to my explanation with more interest than I'd expected. She said she might know someone who could help, someone who specialized in what she called deep web research for academic purposes. She made it sound perfectly legitimate, like there were proper channels for this sort of thing. 2 days later, she gave me a business card with just a name and email address. No company logo or phone number, which should have been a warning sign. She said her contact preferred to keep things simple and would only communicate via email initially. I passed the details on to my brother without really thinking about it. He was desperate to make progress on his dissertation, and Sarah had made it sound like a normal academic resource, the sort of specialist consultant that researchers sometimes use when they need access to areas they can't navigate themselves. My brother emailed the contact that same evening. Within a few hours, he received a reply suggesting they meet for coffee in Leeds to discuss his research requirements. The message was professional and courteous, exactly what you'd expect from someone offering legitimate research assistance. They met the following Saturday at a cafe near the university. My brother described the man as ordinary looking, probably in his 40s, wearing the sort of casual clothes that wouldn't stand out anywhere. He seemed knowledgeable about academic research methods and asked sensible questions about the dissertation requirements. The man explained that he could provide access to several online communities that would be perfect for my brother's research, places where people engaged in completely unfiltered social interaction. which was exactly what the dissertation needed to demonstrate genuine digital behavior patterns. He offered to set up secure access and provide guided tours of these communities, ensuring my brother could observe without compromising his safety or inadvertently breaking any laws. It sounded professional and thorough, like the sort of service that probably existed quite legitimately for researchers. The arrangement was that my brother would pay a small fee upfront for the setup work, then an hourly rate for guided access sessions. Nothing unreasonable, roughly what you might expect to pay for any specialist research assistance. My brother transferred the initial payment that weekend and received detailed instructions for accessing a private communication channel where they could coordinate the research sessions. For the first couple of weeks, everything went exactly as promised. My brother would arrange sessions where he could observe various online communities, while his contact provided context and explanation about what he was seeing. The material was perfect for his dissertation, genuine examples of how people interact when they believe they're completely anonymous. The communities were exactly what his supervisor had suggested he needed to find. People engaging in frank discussions about topics they would never mention in their real lives, forming relationships based purely on shared interests or experiences, creating social hierarchies and rules that were completely different from anything that existed in mainstream society. My brother was making excellent progress on his dissertation. He had more than enough material to support his arguments about authentic digital behavior, and his supervisor was impressed with the quality of his research findings. But somewhere around the third week, things started to shift in ways that were subtle at first. His contact began suggesting additional communities that might be interesting, places that were less directly relevant to the dissertation, but which might provide useful background context. My brother didn't want to seem ungrateful, and the hourly rate meant he wasn't paying for time he didn't want, so he agreed to explore these additional areas. These new communities were darker than the previous ones. Still nothing obviously illegal or dangerous, but the conversations were more intense, more personal. People sharing details about their real lives that went far beyond what seemed safe or sensible. My brother mentioned to me that he was starting to feel uncomfortable with some of what he was seeing. Not because it was threatening, but because it felt too intimate, like he was intruding on private moments that were never meant to be observed by outsiders. I suggested he might want to stick to the original research areas, the ones that were directly relevant to his dissertation. He agreed, but when he mentioned this to his contact, the response was less accommodating than before. The man explained that access to these communities was package-based and that picking and choosing specific areas wasn't really how the service worked. He suggested that my brother was perhaps being overly cautious, and that exposure to a broader range of digital communities would only strengthen his research. This should have been another warning sign, but my brother was so close to finishing his dissertation that he didn't want to risk losing access to the material he'd already gathered. He continued with the sessions, though he found them increasingly uncomfortable. Around the fourth week, his contact started asking more personal questions about my brother's background and interests. Nothing that seemed directly threatening, but queries that went beyond what was necessary for research purposes. Questions about his family, his living situation, his plans after graduation. My brother answered some of these questions without thinking much about it. When you've been working with someone for several weeks, sharing personal details feels natural, like normal conversation. But then the questions became more specific. His contact wanted to know about his daily routines, where he spent time outside of his studies, whether he lived alone. The sort of information that could easily be justified as friendly interest, but which felt increasingly intrusive when combined with everything else. My brother started deflecting these questions, but his contact became more persistent. He suggested that understanding my brother's lifestyle and social context was important for properly interpreting the research material they were gathering together. This is when my brother should have ended the arrangement, but he was afraid of losing access to his research data. His dissertation deadline was approaching, and he'd built his entire project around the material from these communities. Instead, he continued with the sessions while trying to avoid providing any more personal information. But he noticed that his contact seemed to know things about his routine that hadn't been discussed during their conversations. Small details, like mentioning that my brother seemed tired because he'd been up late the previous evening, when my brother was certain he hadn't mentioned staying up late. Or references to specific locations around Leeds that my brother frequented, presented as casual observations about student life in the area. When my brother mentioned these concerns to me, I realized I should have been more careful about who I was putting him in contact with. But by then, he was already deeply involved in the arrangement, and both of us were uncertain about how to extricate him safely. The breaking point came when my brother received an email from his contact containing photographs that had clearly been taken without permission or knowledge. Pictures of my brother walking to and from the university, sitting in the library, meeting friends at various locations around Leeds. The photographs weren't threatening in themselves, but they demonstrated a level of surveillance that went far beyond anything that could be justified for research purposes. The email suggested that these photographs were just examples of the sort of observational research techniques that my brother could learn to use in his own academic work. But the implication was clear. He was being watched, and his contact wanted him to know it. My brother immediately tried to end the arrangement, but when he sent an email explaining that he no longer needed research assistance, the response was not what he expected. His contact explained that the research project had evolved beyond simple academic assistance. My brother had been providing valuable information about student life and social patterns that could be useful for future research projects. The arrangement would need to continue for several more weeks to complete this broader research initiative. The tone of the message had shifted completely. What had previously been professional and accommodating was now directive and non-negotiable. My brother tried to simply stop responding to emails and avoid the arranged sessions, but this triggered a more direct approach. He started receiving text messages on his phone, which he'd never given to his contact. Messages that demonstrated detailed knowledge of his movements and activities, presented as friendly check-ins, but clearly intended to show that avoiding contact wouldn't be possible. The messages would arrive when he was in specific locations, referencing things he was doing or people he was with. Not threatening, but impossible to ignore or dismiss as coincidence. When my brother tried to change his phone number, he discovered that his contact had somehow accessed other forms of communication. Emails to his university account, messages through social media platforms, even contact through people he knew who had somehow been approached with requests to pass on messages. It became clear that his contact had built up a comprehensive profile of my brother's life and social connections, and was prepared to use that information to maintain contact regardless of my brother's preferences. This went on for another month, with my brother becoming increasingly isolated and anxious. He couldn't explain the situation to most people because it sounded paranoid and unbelievable. He couldn't report it to authorities because technically, nothing obviously criminal had occurred. The research assistance had been provided as promised. The payments had been legitimate, and the ongoing contact could be interpreted as professional follow-up. The surveillance felt sinister, but proving that it was unwanted or inappropriate would be difficult. My brother finished his dissertation, but the sense of being constantly observed made it impossible for him to feel any satisfaction in the achievement. Every time he went somewhere or met someone, he found himself wondering whether it was being documented and reported back to his contact. The situation only ended when my brother graduated and moved back home to Manchester. Even then, he received occasional messages for several more weeks, but they eventually stopped once it became clear that his routine had changed completely. We never found out what the real purpose of the arrangement had been, whether it was some kind of recruitment attempt, a data gathering operation, or just someone who enjoyed the sense of control over another person's life. Sarah, the colleague who had provided the original contact, left the company shortly after my brother's graduation. When I tried to ask her about her research contact, she claimed not to remember giving me any details and seemed genuinely confused about what I was referring to. My brother submitted his dissertation and received a good grade, but he never pursued academic research after graduation. The experience had made him too aware of how easily someone's curiosity could be exploited and turned against them. I still think about how different things might have been if I just minded my own business instead of trying to be helpful. My brother had asked for advice, not for me to find him a contact in areas I knew nothing about. The recommendation had seemed harmless at the time, just putting him in touch with someone who might be able to help with legitimate research. But I'd handed over responsibility to a stranger without knowing anything about their real intentions or methods. Even now, I find myself being more careful about who I trust and what information I share. Not because I think I'm still being watched, but because the experience showed me how easily normal social interactions can be manipulated by someone with the right knowledge and patience. The dark web communities my brother had been researching were probably exactly what they appeared to be. Places where people behave differently because they felt anonymous and unobserved. But his contact had been using that same principle in reverse, observing and documenting someone who thought they were engaged in a straightforward professional arrangement. I wonder sometimes how many other people have found themselves in similar situations, having their lives quietly catalogued and analyzed by someone they trusted to provide legitimate services. The sort of thing that would be impossible to prove or report, but which would fundamentally change how you think about your own privacy and safety. My brother never talks about that period anymore, but I know he's more cautious now about who he trusts and what information he shares. We both learned that the biggest dangers don't always come from obviously suspicious sources, but from recommendations that seem perfectly reasonable at the time. My daughter's face appeared on a website I should never have been able to find, and discovering why it was there has made me question every interaction I've had over the past year. I'm still not sure how much of what happened was random and how much was deliberately orchestrated, but I know I played a part in something I'll never be able to make right. I should explain that I'm a single mother living in Southampton. My daughter, Emma, is 7 years old, bright and cheerful. The sort of child who makes friends easily and trusts people instinctively. After her father and I separated 3 years ago, I've done my best to maintain some stability in her life whilst managing work and childcare on my own. I work as a dental receptionist, regular hours that usually align well with school times, though the gaps in coverage have always been a challenge. Last spring, a woman named Caroline approached me in the school playground during pickup. She introduced herself as another parent and said she'd noticed I often seemed rushed during the afternoon collection. She mentioned that she ran a small child-minding service from her home. Nothing official or registered, just helping out a few working parents who needed flexible coverage. She could collect Emma from school on days when I was running late and keep her for an hour or two until I finished work. Caroline seemed genuine enough. She was well dressed, articulate, and knew several of the other parents by name. She showed me photos of her own children on her phone, a boy around Emma's age and a younger girl. Her house was within walking distance of the school, and the rates she quoted were significantly cheaper than the after-school club I'd been struggling to afford. I should have done more research, should have asked for references or checked her credentials properly, but I was exhausted from managing everything alone, and the offer seemed like a practical solution to a persistent problem. We arranged a trial period where Caroline would collect Emma twice a week, on days when my schedule at the dental practice ran later than usual. Emma took to her immediately. She'd come home full of stories about the crafts they'd done, or the games Caroline had taught her. Caroline would send me photos throughout the afternoon, showing Emma playing happily with her children, which was reassuring. Everything seemed to be working exactly as promised. After a few weeks, Caroline mentioned that she sometimes took the children to a local community centre on Wednesday afternoons. They ran various activities for young children, art classes and sports sessions, that sort of thing. She asked if I'd be comfortable with Emma attending these outings as part of the childminding arrangement. I agreed, pleased that Emma would have access to activities I couldn't afford to arrange myself. The Wednesday outings became a regular part of Emma's routine. She'd come home excited about the painting she'd done or the obstacle course she'd completed. Caroline always provided detailed updates about what they'd done, which activities Emma had particularly enjoyed, how she'd interacted with the other children. It all seemed perfectly normal and beneficial for Emma's development. Around 2 months into this arrangement, I received an email from what appeared to be the community centre's administration. It thanked me for enrolling Emma in their program and included an attachment with photos from recent sessions. The email explained that they documented all activities for safeguarding purposes, and parents could download images of their children participating. I opened the attachment and found around 20 photos of Emma at various activities. Painting at an easel, playing with building blocks, running through an obstacle course. She looked happy and engaged in all of them, exactly as Caroline had described. I saved a few of my favorites and didn't think much more about it. The following week, I received another email with more photos, then another the week after that. The frequency seemed excessive for a small community centre program, but I assumed they were just thorough about documentation. Emma appeared in most of the photos, sometimes with other children, sometimes on her own. The quality was professional, better than I'd expect from staff members casually documenting activities. It was Emma's teacher who first made me question the arrangement. She mentioned during Parents' Evening that Emma had been talking about her Wednesday activities with Caroline. The teacher seemed slightly concerned, asking whether I'd verified that Caroline was properly qualified and insured for childminding. I admitted I hadn't done formal checks, and the teacher suggested I should, particularly if Emma was being taken to venues outside Caroline's home. That conversation planted a seed of doubt. When I got home, I tried to search for information about Caroline's childminding service online. I found nothing. No website, no business registration, no reviews or recommendations. I searched for the community centre she'd mentioned and couldn't find any facility by that name in our area. I called Caroline the next day to ask for more details about where exactly she was taking Emma. She seemed surprised by the question, slightly defensive even. She gave me an address for the community centre and assured me it was a perfectly legitimate facility run by volunteers. When I searched for that address, I found it was actually a private residence, not a community facility at all. That's when I started to panic. I'd been allowing a woman I barely knew to take my daughter to an unknown location every week for 2 months. I'd received professional photographs of Emma that supposedly came from a community center that didn't exist, and I had no idea what was actually happening during those Wednesday afternoons. I confronted Caroline at school pickup that day, asking her directly what was going on. She became evasive, claiming there must have been some confusion about the address, that the community center operated from various locations. When I pressed her for specifics, she simply said she couldn't continue the child-minding arrangement and walked away. I never saw her at the school again after that day. I reported everything to the school immediately. They had no record of any parent named Caroline with children at the school. The photos she'd shown me of her supposed children weren't in any of their class photographs. She'd been approaching parents outside the school gates for months, presenting herself as another parent, but no one knew who she actually was or where she'd come from. The police took my statement and began investigating. They asked for copies of all the photos I'd received and details of every interaction I'd had with Caroline. They seemed particularly concerned about the professional quality of the photographs and the fact that they'd been sent to me through email rather than being available through any official channels. What they discovered made me feel physically sick. The photos hadn't come from any community centre. They'd been taken at a private address in Portsmouth, a house owned by someone with previous convictions for child exploitation offences. The property had been set up to look like a children's activity space, complete with toys, craft supplies, and play equipment, specifically for photographing children whose parents thought they were attending legitimate programs. Caroline wasn't her real name, and she'd been operating this scheme across multiple schools in the region for over a year. She'd approach single parents who seemed overwhelmed, offer affordable child-minding services, gain trust over several weeks, and then introduce the supposed community center activities. The children were never harmed physically, but they were photographed extensively in various activities and settings. The photos were then sold on the dark web, marketed as candid images of children engaged in innocent activities. The clients who purchased them weren't looking for explicit content, at least not initially. They wanted authentic photographs of real children in everyday situations, images that appeared natural and unstaged. The prices varied based on the child's appearance and how many different activity sets had been photographed. The police showed me the website where Emma's photos had been listed. I had to access it through their systems, since it wasn't available through normal internet browsing. The site was organized like a stock photography service, with categories for different activities and age groups. Emma's photos were catalogued under multiple categories: arts and crafts, outdoor play, educational activities. Each photo had been viewed hundreds of times, and several complete sets had been purchased. What made it worse was realizing the emails I'd received weren't all the photos that existed. Those were just samples, proof that the child in the listings was real and that new content was being regularly produced. The full collections were much larger, containing images from angles I'd never seen, showing Emma in situations I hadn't been told about. Close-ups of her face, shots that focused on specific aspects of her appearance, carefully composed photographs that had obviously been taken by someone with experience in this particular type of content. The investigation revealed that Caroline worked with several other people who performed different roles in the operation. Someone else owned the property where the photos were taken. Another person managed the website and handled client communications. Caroline's specific role was recruitment, identifying potential targets and building enough trust to gain regular access to the children. They'd refined the approach over time, learning which parents were most vulnerable to the offer of affordable child-minding. Single parents, particularly mothers who who were juggling work and childcare alone were ideal targets. The promise of flexibility and low cost made it difficult to refuse, and the gradual introduction of the community center activities made the whole thing seem like a genuine enrichment opportunity for the children. Emma was one of 7 children who'd been photographed at that property over the past year. The others belonged to parents in similar situations, all of whom thought their children were attending legitimate activities. None of us had checked Caroline's credentials properly. None of us had visited the supposed community center. We'd all been too grateful for affordable help to ask the difficult questions we should have asked. The police arrested 4 people in connection with the operation. Caroline, whose real name was Sarah and who had no children of her own, received a prison sentence for child exploitation and fraud. The property owner received a longer sentence due to his previous convictions. The others involved received various punishments, though the sentences seemed inadequate given what they'd done. The website was shut down, but the police confirmed the photos had been downloaded by numerous clients before they could seize the servers. Emma's images, along with those of the other children, were almost certainly saved on private devices and potentially redistributed through other platforms. Once digital content exists, removing every copy becomes nearly impossible. I had to explain to Emma why she couldn't see Caroline anymore, why the police needed to ask her questions about the Wednesday activities. She didn't understand what had happened, couldn't grasp why the fun afternoons she'd enjoyed were actually something sinister. She just knew that something had changed and that I seemed upset whenever the subject came up. The hardest part was dealing with my own guilt. I'd handed my daughter over to a stranger because it was convenient and affordable. I'd accepted vague explanations about community centers without verifying any details. I'd received professional photographs of my child and never questioned why a casual child-minding arrangement would involve such high-quality documentation. I kept thinking about all the small warning signs I'd ignored or rationalized away. The way Caroline always seemed to be free whenever I needed help, as though she had no other commitments. The fact that I'd never seen her children, only photos she'd shown me. The absence of any online presence for her supposed child-minding service. The detailed updates she provided after each session, which I now understood, were designed to prevent me from asking Emma too many questions about what she'd actually been doing. The other parents whose children had been involved were dealing with their own versions of the same guilt and horror. We formed a strange sort of support group, united by our shared experience of being manipulated and our children being exploited. None of us had been negligent in any legal sense, but we all felt responsible for having trusted the wrong person. I moved Emma to a different school the following term. The old school held too many associations with Caroline and the playground where she'd first approached me. The new school has strict policies about who can collect children, requiring formal authorization and identification checks for anyone who isn't a parent. They were understanding about our situation when I explained why I needed those extra safeguards in place. I still receive occasional notifications from the police about the ongoing investigation. They're trying to identify and locate everyone who purchased photos from that website, though they've admitted it's nearly impossible given the nature of dark web transactions. They've managed to identify some clients in the UK, but many were overseas, beyond the reach of British law enforcement. Sometimes I search for Emma's name online, checking if any of those photos have surfaced in public spaces. I've never found anything, which should be reassuring, but isn't really. I know the photos exist somewhere, in private collections and hidden corners of the internet I can't access. I know that somewhere, people who purchased those images are still looking at them, and there's nothing I can do about it. Emma is 9 now, seemingly unaffected by what happened. She doesn't remember much about those Wednesday afternoons, just that they were fun, and that she's confused about why she can't see Caroline anymore. I haven't told her the full truth about what those activities were actually for. I don't know if I ever will, or if it's better to let her remember them as the innocent afternoons she thought they were. But I remember every photo I received, every email that thanked me for enrolling Emma in a program that didn't exist. I remember Caroline's friendly smile in the playground, and how relieved I felt when she first offered to help. I remember thinking I'd found the perfect solution to my childcare problems, never imagining I was actually handing my daughter to someone who saw her as content to be produced and sold. The guilt doesn't fade. 2 years later, I still question every decision I make regarding Emma's care. I'm hypervigilant about who she spends time with, to the point where it probably affects her social development. I can't bring myself to use childminders or after-school clubs, even legitimate registered services with proper credentials. I've reduced my working hours so I can always do the school pickup myself. Even though the financial strain is significant, I've learned that the dark web isn't just a place where illegal goods are traded. It's where ordinary moments from children's lives can be commodified and sold to people whose interest in those moments is anything but ordinary. It's where professional-looking websites can exist without any oversight, hosting content that shouldn't exist at all. And it's where photos of my daughter, taken during afternoons I thought were enriching her life, continue to circulate in spaces I'll never be able to access or control. The police kept telling me I wasn't at fault, that the operation was sophisticated and deliberately targeted vulnerable parents. But I know I could have been more careful. I could have checked Caroline's credentials properly. I could have visited the supposed community center before allowing Emma to go there. I could have asked more questions when something seemed too good to be true. Instead, I was grateful for help and tired from managing everything alone, and someone exploited that vulnerability in a way I never saw coming. That's what keeps me awake now. Not just what happened to Emma, but what might be happening to other children whose parents are facing the same struggles I was. How many other single mothers are being approached in school playgrounds right now by people claiming to offer affordable childminding? How many are accepting out of desperation, never suspecting what those services actually involve? I wanted to warn other parents, to share my story as a cautionary tale about checking credentials and trusting instincts. But doing so means admitting publicly what happened, potentially exposing Emma to questions and judgment she doesn't deserve. So instead, I remain silent, carrying this knowledge alone, hoping that somehow my mistake won't be repeated by others who find themselves in similar circumstances. The photos exist. The website was replicated before it was shut down, probably multiple times, preserving all the content for anyone who wants to access it. Emma's face is out there in those hidden corners of the internet, tagged and categorized, available to people I'll never identify. And there's absolutely nothing I can do except hope that one day, somehow, all traces of those images will disappear. But I know they won't. Digital content is permanent, especially when it exists in spaces designed to preserve what mainstream internet would delete. That's the reality I live with now. Not the dramatic horror of immediate danger, but the quiet, persistent horror of knowing something irreversible happened, and that my daughter's childhood innocence was documented and distributed for purposes I can barely stand to think about. All because I accepted help from someone whose friendliness masked something much darker, and I didn't ask the right questions until it was far too late. Right, so this is going to sound absurd, but I've got to tell someone what's been happening to me, because I'm honestly not sure what to do anymore. I've always been the sort of person who minds their own business, keeps their head down, pays the bills on time. You know the type. Nothing exciting ever happens to people like me, which is exactly how I preferred it. I work from home doing proofreading for small publishers, live alone in a rented terraced house in Didcot. That's nothing special, but it suits me fine. My biggest worry used to be whether I'd have enough work to cover the rent each month. That all changed about 6 months ago when my washing machine packed up. Sounds trivial, doesn't it? The sort of everyday annoyance that happens to everyone eventually. But what started as a simple repair job has turned into something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. And I keep wondering if I'm losing my mind, or if this is actually as serious as it seems. The machine had been making grinding noises for weeks before it finally gave up completely. Nothing dramatic, just stopped mid-cycle one Tuesday morning, leaving me with a drum full of soggy clothes and no obvious way to get them clean. I rent a small terraced house in Didcot, and the landlord's policy is that tenants handle their own appliance repairs, so I started looking for local washing machine engineers. That's how I found Dave's number, scribbled on a card pinned to the notice board in the local co-op. No fancy business name or website address, just Dave, all appliances fixed, with a mobile number written in blue biro. The sort of basic advertising you see from tradesmen who rely on word of mouth rather than internet marketing. I called him that afternoon and he sounded professional enough over the phone. Said he could come round the following day during his lunch break to have a look at the machine, and that his call-out fee was £30 whether he could fix it or not. Standard rates for that sort of work, and he seemed keen to fit me in quickly. Dave turned out to be a short, stocky bloke in his 40s, wearing navy overalls and carrying a toolbox that looked like it had seen better days. He was polite and methodical, spending nearly an hour diagnosing the problem with my machine. Eventually, he concluded that the drum bearings had failed and would need replacing, but the parts would cost more than the machine was worth. Instead of trying to sell me an expensive repair, he suggested I might be better off buying a replacement. He mentioned that he occasionally had refurbished machines available and that he could probably source something suitable within my budget if I wasn't in a rush. This seemed reasonable enough, so I gave him my contact details and asked him to let me know if anything appropriate came up. He said he'd keep an eye out and would call me within the week if he found anything promising. Dave called 3 days later with details of a nearly new machine that had come from a house clearance. The previous owners had moved abroad unexpectedly and couldn't take their appliances with them, so everything was being sold off cheaply. He could deliver and install it for £200, which was significantly less than I'd expected to pay for a decent replacement. I arranged for him to bring it round the following Saturday morning. He arrived punctually with the machine loaded in the back of his van, along with a young lad he introduced as his nephew who was helping with deliveries. The installation went smoothly, and the machine worked perfectly when we tested it with a quick wash cycle. Dave explained the various settings and programs, then spent several minutes showing me how to clean the filter and maintain the rubber seals to prevent future problems. But there was something about his behavior during the installation that struck me as odd. He seemed unusually interested in the layout of my house, asking questions about my work schedule and whether I lived alone. When I mentioned that I worked from home as a freelance proofreader, he made several comments about how convenient it must be to have such a flexible routine. He also spent considerable time examining my existing plumbing and electrical connections, taking photographs with his phone supposedly, to ensure he had the right fittings for future reference. This seemed professional enough, but he photographed more than just the utility connections. I noticed him capturing images of my kitchen layout, the view from my windows, and even the contents of some cupboards while he was checking pipework. At the time, I assumed this was just thoroughness on his part. Some tradesmen are very methodical about documenting their work, and Dave had been professional in every other respect. It was only later that I started questioning his motives for gathering so much information about my living arrangements. The first sign that something wasn't right came about 2 weeks after the installation. I started receiving marketing calls from companies I'd never heard of, all offering services that seemed remarkably well tailored to my specific circumstances. There were calls about home security systems that would be ideal for someone living alone in a terraced house. Offers of broadband upgrades that mentioned my work from home situation, despite the fact that I'd never discussed my internet usage with any service providers. Even unsolicited quotes for household insurance that included specific details about my property layout and contents. The callers knew too much about my personal circumstances for this to be coincidental marketing. Someone had provided them with detailed information about my living situation, work arrangements, and daily routine. I started paying attention to other changes in my routine that had occurred since Dave's visit. I'd been receiving more posts addressed to previous occupants of my house, including bank statements and official documents that suggested someone was using my address for financial services I'd never heard of. There had also been several instances of people knocking on my door asking for directions or claiming to be conducting surveys, but their questions seemed more focused on confirming my identity and schedule than gathering general information. Most concerning was a pattern of minor problems with services and deliveries. My internet connection had become unreliable. My post was being delivered at inconsistent times, and I'd received several packages that I hadn't ordered, but which contained items that were obviously intended for someone monitoring my daily activities. These packages contained things like small electronic devices, camera equipment, and recording equipment that had no obvious legitimate purpose for someone in my circumstances. I began to suspect that Dave's visit had been more than a simple appliance repair and replacement operation. Looking back at his behavior during the installation, I realized that his questions about my routine and his extensive photography of my property had been systematic rather than casual. He'd been gathering intelligence about my living situation for reasons that had nothing to do with washing machine maintenance. I tried to contact him using the mobile number from his original advertisement, but it was no longer in service. The card had disappeared from the co-op notice board, and none of the local appliance repair businesses I contacted had heard of anyone called Dave operating in the area. He'd vanished completely, leaving only the washing machine and the growing evidence that my personal information was being circulated among people with unknown motives for wanting detailed intelligence about my daily life. I started researching similar cases online, looking for information about tradesmen who used service calls as opportunities to gather personal information for identity theft or other criminal purposes. What I found suggested this was a more common problem than I'd realized, but the cases I discovered seemed to focus on financial fraud rather than the comprehensive surveillance I was experiencing. Following various leads and references led me into online communities where people discussed more sophisticated forms of personal intelligence gathering. Some of these communities operated through private channels that required special access methods to reach. Eventually, I found myself exploring parts of the internet that exist beyond normal search engines. What I discovered was that Dave hadn't been working alone, and his operation wasn't focused on traditional financial fraud. The platforms I accessed contained extensive databases of personal information about ordinary people, organized by location, lifestyle, and vulnerability factors. My own details were there, listed under a section that seemed to specialize in people who lived alone and worked from home. The information was remarkably comprehensive, including not just the basic details Dave had observed during his visit, but additional intelligence that had been gathered through other methods. Details about my work clients, my financial situation, my social relationships, and my daily routine that could only have been obtained through systematic monitoring of my activities. But this wasn't a passive database. It was an active marketplace where detailed personal information was being sold to buyers with specific requirements. The platform operated like a sophisticated customer service operation, with different categories of information available at various price points. Basic profiles cost relatively small amounts, but comprehensive intelligence packages that included real-time monitoring and regular updates were priced at several £1,000s. Dave's role had been what they called primary access acquisition, gaining entry to target properties under legitimate pretexts and gathering initial intelligence that could then be developed through other methods. The washing machine replacement had been a perfect cover for conducting a thorough survey of my living situation while establishing credibility for future contact. But the operation didn't stop with Dave's visit. The information he'd gathered had been used to coordinate a comprehensive monitoring program that involved multiple people and various surveillance methods. The marketing calls, the misdirected post, the unexpected deliveries. All of this had been part of a systematic intelligence gathering operation designed to build a complete picture of my daily life and personal circumstances. The buyers for this information weren't necessarily planning traditional crimes like burglary or identity theft. Many seemed to be purchasing personal intelligence for psychological reasons that were harder to understand, but potentially more disturbing. There were discussion threads about clients who used the gathered information to create elaborate fantasies about their relationships with the surveillance targets. They would study the intelligence reports in obsessive detail, learning intimate facts about strangers' daily routines and personal habits. Some took this further, using the information to engineer coincidental encounters with their targets, or to insert themselves into their daily routines through carefully planned interactions. Others seemed content to simply observe from a distance, knowing that they had access to private information about people who remained completely unaware they were being monitored. But the most disturbing category of buyers were those who used the personal intelligence as preparation for what they called direct engagement activities. These clients were purchasing comprehensive information about specific individuals as groundwork for more serious interventions that required detailed knowledge of their targets' vulnerabilities and daily routines. Reading through the client testimonials and service reviews, I began to understand that Dave's visit had been the beginning of a much larger operation that was still ongoing. The monitoring hadn't stopped when he'd completed the washing machine installation. It had simply moved to more subtle methods that were harder to detect, but potentially more invasive than his initial intelligence gathering. My internet activities were being tracked, my phone calls were being monitored, and my daily movements were being documented through methods I couldn't identify, but which provided whoever was watching me with real-time information about my activities and whereabouts. The evidence was in the precision of the marketing calls and unsolicited approaches I'd been receiving. The callers knew not just my basic personal details, but also my current mood, my recent purchases, and even my immediate plans for the day. They were accessing information that could only be obtained through comprehensive surveillance of my digital communications and physical activities. I realized that the washing machine Dave had installed probably contained monitoring equipment that was providing ongoing access to my home network and personal devices. The machine was connected to my Wi-Fi for diagnostic purposes, and it would be relatively simple to use that connection for unauthorized data collection. But I also suspected that my property had been accessed again since Dave's visit, probably to install additional surveillance equipment in locations where it would be virtually undetectable. The pattern of minor service problems I'd been experiencing, internet outages, delivery issues, unexpected correspondence, could all be explained as methods for testing and maintaining surveillance systems that had been installed throughout my property. I was living in a house that had been comprehensively compromised by people who were monitoring my every activity and selling that information to anonymous buyers with unknown motivations. The realization made me physically sick, but it also explained why I'd been feeling increasingly paranoid and anxious over the past few months. My subconscious had been picking up on signs of surveillance that my rational mind had dismissed as coincidence. I started paying closer attention to my environment, looking for evidence of the monitoring equipment I now knew had been installed throughout my property. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. There were small cameras concealed in light fittings and smoke detectors, audio recording devices hidden in electrical outlets, and monitoring equipment built into appliances I'd assumed were legitimate. The washing machine Dave had installed was certainly part of the surveillance network, but it was just one component in a comprehensive monitoring system that covered every room in my house. They could see and hear everything I did, 24 hours a day, and they were presumably sharing that information with the clients who had purchased access to my personal intelligence profile. But discovering the surveillance equipment didn't provide any obvious path toward removing it or escaping from their monitoring network. The devices were professionally installed and integrated into my property's essential systems in ways that would make removal virtually impossible without completely rewiring the house. Even if I could identify and disable all the obvious surveillance equipment, there were probably backup systems and remote monitoring methods that would maintain their access to my personal information. More troubling was the realization that moving to a different property wouldn't solve the problem. The intelligence they'd gathered about my routine, preferences, and behavior patterns would allow them to re-establish surveillance wherever I relocated. They knew me well enough to predict my actions and could simply repeat Dave's initial approach with whatever cover story seemed most appropriate for my new circumstances. I was trapped in a surveillance network that had been designed to be inescapable once the initial intelligence gathering had been completed. The only way to stop the monitoring would be to somehow identify and confront the people operating the network, but they remained completely anonymous and operated through platforms that were designed to protect their identities. I could report the surveillance to the police, but what evidence could I provide beyond my suspicions about a washing machine repair that had seemed legitimate at the time? The monitoring equipment had been professionally concealed, and the intelligence marketplace operated through channels that would be virtually impossible for authorities to investigate. Even if I could prove that surveillance was taking place, the operators could simply claim it was legitimate research or marketing activity. The information they were gathering and selling wasn't necessarily illegal. It was just comprehensively invasive. I've been living with this knowledge for 3 months now, trying to maintain normal routines, while knowing that everything I do is being monitored and potentially shared with anonymous buyers who might have any number of motivations for wanting detailed access to my private life. The psychological pressure is worse than any physical threat could be. Knowing that your most private moments are being observed and commodified creates a level of paranoia that makes normal life almost impossible to maintain. But I've also started to notice changes in my circumstances that suggest the monitoring operation is moving to a new phase. People have begun approaching me in public places, engaging in conversations that demonstrate surprising knowledge about my personal interests and daily routine. Shop assistants who know details about my purchasing habits that they shouldn't have access to. Neighbors who seem unusually interested in my work schedule and social relationships. Even delivery drivers and service technicians who visit my property seem to know more about my circumstances than their professional roles should require. I'm surrounded by people who have access to intimate details about my private life, while I remain ignorant of their true motivations for engaging with me. The surveillance network hasn't just been monitoring me, it's been building a comprehensive profile that can be used to engineer social interactions and manipulate my daily environment in ways that remain virtually undetectable. I think they're preparing for something that requires more direct access than remote surveillance can provide. Yesterday, I received a call from someone claiming to be Dave's business partner, explaining that they needed to perform routine maintenance on the washing machine he'd installed. They offered to come round this weekend to check the connections and update the software systems. I know this is the next phase of whatever operation began with Dave's initial visit 6 months ago. But I also know that refusing the appointment would only confirm their assessment that I've become aware of their surveillance activities, which might accelerate whatever they're planning to do next. Sometimes the only choice available is between cooperating with people who are exploiting you or resisting them in ways that might make your situation even worse. I'm going to let them into my house this weekend because I don't think I have any realistic alternative. But I wanted to document what I've learned in case something happens to me, or in case my behavior suddenly changes in ways that concern people who know me. If you're reading this, be careful about letting tradesmen into your home, especially ones who seem unusually interested in your personal circumstances, or who ask more questions than their work requires. Dave is probably still out there, looking for new targets and gathering intelligence for clients who remain completely anonymous, but definitely aren't benign. Your washing machine breaking down might seem like a minor inconvenience, but it could be the beginning of something much worse than you ever imagined possible.